listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Did you hear the one about the head chopping, throat slipping, heart eating, gay murdering, women hating, freedom fighters who got a marvellous press in the West? Well, you should do, because you paid for it. Thanks to Anonymous and the great Ben Norton and the Grey Zone Project, we're bringing you some pretty groundbreaking stuff that will make your hair stand on end. And as war looms between Turkish-backed Azerbaijan and Russian-backed Armenia over Nagorno-Karabakh, we ask, will we be in the middle of a full-scale war tomorrow? We're certainly in the wars with the coronavirus, with Glasgow now the worst affected place in the whole of the United Kingdom. It's funny that Nicola Sturgeon was doing such a wonderful job, at least according to the Brexit-hating, Boris-baiting Liberals in London. And of course, we'll be talking to the legend himself. Max Kaiser advised me to get into Bitcoin when the price was less than tall $10 a shot. Thanks, Max. It's now at $11,000. At least it was the last time I looked, and I look every hour or so, as you could imagine. So fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be rock and roll radio with pictures all night for the next 3 hours on the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
And this is London, but coming to you, of course, all over the world, thanks to the wonders of the internet and SputnikNews.com. We're also on FM in the Washington, D.C. area, where we're developing quite an audience with a hardy bunch of renegades, I suppose, listening to us every week inside the Capitol building itself. We're also on AM from Burning City to Burning City, right across the United States of America, from coast to coast. And you can listen anywhere in the world on SputnikNews.com. But last week, 873,000 of you watched as well as listened. The second highest viewing audience that we have ever had. And that makes us officially, unless you can tell me otherwise, the biggest show of its kind on the entire planet. A truly global university of the airwaves. You want a comparator? The BBC's flagship programme Newsnight struggles to get over 200,000 viewers. It's on 5 nights a week. It only just beats us on 5 programmes. It's not even a quarter of our current level of viewership. And that's without a single mention in any of the so-called mainstream media. So if you are one of those watching now on Facebook, please share with all of your friends, all of your contacts. You can watch, of course, on my Facebook, on RT's multiple Facebook pages. You can watch on my YouTube and on RT's multiple YouTube platforms. You can watch on Twitter, and you can even watch on Instagram and something called Twitch, which always makes me shiver. Now, as I was coming into the studio, the news broke that Syrian mercenaries were speeding to the front in Nagorno-Karabakh, transported there by the Turkish regime of Erdogan. transferred to Azerbaijan, who have announced that they are going to finish this Nagorno-Karabakh problem. A kind of final solution. And that would be appropriate because the last time a Turk talked about finishing anything to do with Armenians, it led to a genocide, second only to the Holocaust, just some years later in the run-up to and throughout the Second World War. A final solution implemented by the Syrian head-chopping, throat-slitting, gay-murdering, heart-eating, women-hating, freedom fighters that we have been supporting for a decade in Syria. Bitter, moi, extremely bitter. Not just bitter about what the head choppers have been doing in Syria against Christians, against other Muslims, against other Sunni Muslims who didn't accept the narrow interpretation of Islam of these Salafist fronts affiliated with Al-Qaeda and with ISIS. I'm angry about that, but I'm equally angry that we paid for it. I was one of the voices in the Houses of Parliament behind me that warned and warned and warned again that the Frankenstein monsters that we were supporting in Syria would one day spill out, cascade across our own streets, which they did in Paris and in London, allegedly on the very same day this week. You can't pick and choose, you see, which monsters you support and which you're going to crack down on in your own country, because these monsters recognize no borders. And the stronger you make them over there, the more dangerous they will be when they come over here. And they're here in our midst. A brave police sergeant, unarmed, shot dead in Croydon police station, inside the custody suite of a Croydon police station this week. 4 innocent passers-by just walking in the 11th arrondissement in Paris, which had the misfortune some years ago of being the place where the Charlie Hebdo magazine was based, were macheted, their throats cut, their heads almost severed from their shoulders. They haven't gone away, you know, these fanatic extremists. And now they are on the front line between Azerbaijan and Armenia, which will inevitably, as it did in Syria, draw Russia into the fight. Indeed, that may be the very point. The Turco-Russian war in Syria just got transported into the borderlands between Azerbaijan and Armenia. But of course, it's the crimes committed by these very mercenaries in Syria that will provide the first part of this show this evening. Because earlier this week, I received a document dump at an address I don't publicize from the group calling itself Anonymous. That document dump was voluminous, to say the least. I didn't have time to carefully study it all, so I sent it to my friends through the glass, saying this is important enough to lead the show on Sunday. But little did I know that all the devils in the detail would be filleted and packaged brilliantly by the estimable Grey Zone Project and one of our favorite correspondents of all time, young Ben Norton. He distilled this gigantic anonymous document dump into the most startling revelation you could possibly imagine. You see, you may have wondered how these cutthroats, head choppers, heart eaters could possibly have got such a fair press in Britain and in the West, and the answer is because you paid for it. Not that you knew it, of course. You paid for it secretly. The British government, using your money, secretly funded an entire public relations industry, providing a blizzard of white helmets and fake chemical weapons attacks and all the paraphernalia of the newly moderate Syrian opposition. You paid for all of that. You built up an entire industry of fake news about Syria. Now, most of us knew it in our hearts. Most of us smelt a rat over Duma. Most of us smelt a rat over the work of the white helmets as they climbed all the way up to the Oscars, thanking their mothers and their sisters, thanking everyone except those that helped them the most. You, the British taxpayer, spent scores of millions, maybe more than 100 million. Imagine, in this cash-strapped, COVID-stricken country, we may have spent £100 million of British taxpayers' money on fake news, propaganda for the affiliates of Al-Qaeda and ISIS, whilst hunting them in Croydon, whilst hunting them in Paris. We were paying for them in Syria. If that doesn't make you mad, you must already be dead, which is exactly what ISIS and Al-Qaeda would prefer that you were. Thanks to Anonymous, and thanks to Ben Norton and the Grey Zone, we've got the names, we've got the pack drill, we've got the check numbers, we've got the numbers in the check box. We know who was being paid what out of our money to pay for propaganda that almost over Duma took the whole world to war. Don't forget that. The fake chemical weapon attack almost brought World War III. Almost caused a superpower conflagration between Russia, the United States of America, and its foolish or knavish allies, Britain and France, principally amongst them. I often say, as a joke, you couldn't make it up. You couldn't make this up. But they made it up. They made all of it up. And thanks to these documents from Anonymous and Ben Norton's analysis of those documents, we've got the receipts. We've got the chapter and verse. And we're going to talk to Ben Norton in the first hour on this subject. It's not just that they fooled you over Syria. I have apparently sane, grown men calling this show and talking to me about concentration camps in China. In the media, claims of 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. It's all from the same people. It's all from the people who told you that Iraq was bristling with nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons. The same people who lied to you over Syria are lying to you about China, lying to you about Russia, and they'll be lying tomorrow about Armenia. I have no doubt at all about that. And even when it's abundantly obvious that each lie turns into disaster, not just exposed as a lie, but an actual boomerang that rebounds against our national interest and the safety of our people, our so-called media leads us over and over and over again into the same kind of morass. And we're still in a mess over the coronavirus, aren't we? We now have Glasgow as the worst affected area in Britain. We're now told that the Scottish parliamentary elections, which should have been held last May now have to be postponed again from next May. Well, I tell you now, if that's the case, then the separatist, secessionist government of Nicola Sturgeon must be replaced by a government of national unity. We cannot allow a government to stay in power, a minority government to stay in power year after year as elections are postponed and postponed. And if that does not happen, then direct rule from Westminster will have to be reimposed. Better, Miss Sturgeon, that you bring the Conservatives, Labour and the Liberal Democrats into the government. A government of national unity to combat this crisis, both health and economic, that is afflicting the people of Scotland so severely. Now, the coronavirus, which has cut a swathe through our people for the great majority of this year, will be in the third hour. And we'll be asking if the same police force that presided over the fiasco in the Croydon police station, where a man in handcuffs in a custody suite is able to murder a police officer, presumably shooting through his legs at the police officer's chest, didn't go far too far in Trafalgar Square yesterday. 10, 15,000, many of them nutters, COVID deniers, David Icke types, but many of them ordinary British citizens, exercising what they believed to be their rights of peaceful protest in the crucible of public protest in Britain, in Trafalgar Square, were set about by truncheon-wielding police officers, bowling them left and right, breaking their skulls. It didn't look good to me. It doesn't look good to me for Cressida Dick, the Commissioner of the Metropolitan Police. It's been a bad week for her. And it doesn't look good for the so-called Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, looking like a little boy lost as all these problems swirl around his head. We'll be talking about all of that in the final hour. But here's the first poll. Who is the least charismatic? A, Sir Keir Starmer. B, Joe Biden. C, a block of wood. That's a close one. Well done, lads. That's as close a contest as I have seen in a long time. Fasten your seatbelts. It's going to be a big show tonight, I promise.
Radio Sputnik.
Now, I've got a long list of places that you can watch as well as listen. Of course, listeners are just as valuable to us as viewers. We're not vain or anything. We like to think that as many people are listening as are watching. But if you are watching, here's where you can do it. Moats TV Twitter, Moats TV Facebook, Twitch, on RT International's YouTube and RT International's Facebook, on RT UK's YouTube and RT UK's Facebook, on RT UK's Twitter, and on George Galloway Facebook, George Galloway YouTube, George Galloway Twitter, and on FM in the Washington, D.C. area of the United States, 105.5 FM there. And right across the United States on AM out of Maryland. And the monologue is streamed as usual on Instagram. And thousands, of course, are listening on our good friends, SputnikNews.com. Download their app. Why don't you? Join the growing number of people studying at the Open University of the Airwaves.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
Now, the public relations machine created by British and American taxpayers to lie to the world about Syria boasted that they were in contact, close contact, with 1,600 journalists and influencers. And I think I know most of them. I just have to glance at their work about Syria and I can tell they've been in close contact with the lie machine revealed by Anonymous and by the great Ben Norton of the even greater Grey Zone Project, who joins us now live across the Atlantic. Ben, thank you very much. 1,600 journalists and influencers. I reckon I could name a good few hundred of those, couldn't you?
Yeah, absolutely, George. Thanks for that great introduction. I have to say that, unfortunately, these documents are not really a surprise. They're confirming what we've known for many years. But what's incredible about these documents that I went through, and I wrote a report at the Grey Zone just showing some of the highlights of these hundreds of pages of documents. These are materials that were filed with the UK Foreign and Commonwealth Office. So it's largely focusing on the British angle, although many of these contractors that were included in the documents are contractors that work with other Western governments as well, including the United States, Denmark, the Netherlands, even the European Union and the United Nations. So this is very much an international propaganda initiative. And of course, like I said, it's not surprising to learn about this, but what is kind of shocking is the breadth, the scale of this propaganda campaign. You mentioned that one of the firms called Incostrat, which is a Western government contractor, boasted that it was in constant contact with over 1,600 journalists and influencers focusing on Syria. We also know that more than half of the stringers, so stringers are journalists on the ground who are kind of freelancers who provide video content to international media. More than half of the stringers on the ground in Syria that were used regularly by Al Jazeera were trained by these British government contractors. They took credit for training hundreds of media activists inside Syria. And when I say media activists, we should keep in mind these are not impartial journalists who are being trained. These are people who are being trained in information warfare, because these Western governments understood that if they had Syrians on the ground, if they gave them the equipment, the training, the materials, and then help them get those the materials they recorded into Western media platforms, they could propagandize the world. They're not trying to provide a balanced, nuanced take on what's happening in Syria. This is propaganda, nonstop, demonizing the Syrian government and saying very little about what the actual conditions were on the ground in the territory controlled by these so-called rebels. Of course, what these journalists, these so-called journalists, these media activists, what they didn't mention in their reports is the ethnic cleansing of ethnic and religious minorities, is the horrific conditions that women were put into. In the case of some women were enslaved and turned into prostitutes and sex trafficked. So, I mean, what's incredible about this propaganda is how extremely one-sided it was. And if you look at the documents, they say very clearly that these Western government initiatives that they launched were training these activists in order to do that. It's just all out in the open. It's absolutely incredible.
Well, we'll come back to why it was put into the open, which is a story in itself. But let me get this right. Countries like Denmark, the Netherlands, achingly politically correct, gender sensitive, sexual orientation sensitive, were paying for propaganda for areas controlled by these rebels, where gay people were thrown off the roof and videoed being so done, where women were being stoned and murdered after mere accusations of adultery, where women were not just enslaved and sex trafficked, but even the women who were not so physically harmed became prisoners in their own houses, in their own all-enveloping black clothes. All these right-on liberals were paying these activists to snow job the people who were responsible for all these crimes. That's breathtaking, isn't it?
Absolutely, George. And I commented in my article, my report on these documents. There was one moment that was absolutely breathtaking, just jaw-dropping in the hypocrisy. Two of the main firms that we're talking about here that were working with the British government and other Western governments to push this propaganda initiative in Syria are called ARC, A-R-K, and the other one is called the Global Strategy Network, TGSN. Now, TGSN, by the way, keep in mind, was founded by the former head of counterterrorism for MI6. So this is an MI6 cutout. And in their documents, they were talking about how these firms they were actually directly running so-called rebel media operations. They created their own so-called rebel media platforms that were run by Western government cutouts. I mean, so the attempt to portray this as some kind of grassroots movement is laughable. But one of the documents they have, I'll read a quote from it here. It's absolutely incredible. It's their document to make sure that they, quote, follow UK guidance on gender sensitivity. So the firms that signed this are called ARK and TGSN. These were also the firms that were running the civil infrastructure and the social media for Idlib. Idlib is still right now controlled by al-Qaeda. It's the rebranded form of Syria's al-Qaeda affiliate, Jabhat al-Nusra, which is the largest al-Qaeda affiliate since the 9/11 attacks. It's absolutely massive, tens of thousands of extremist hardened fighters. And inside Idlib, women were executed publicly. In the public, they were shot in the head because they were accused of adultery. There's videos of this online. Meanwhile, this British government and U.S. government contractor, ARK, was running Idlib City Council's Facebook page and providing other services to ARK. And at the same time, it signed a deal with the UK Foreign Office on gender sensitivity and declared that, quote, it will ensure gender is considered in all capacity building and campaign development. I mean, it's absolutely dystopian. You can't make up something this hypocritical.
No, you couldn't make it up. And also in your splendid report, which I really urge everyone to read. In fact, it's mandatory to attend the Mother of All Talk Shows Open University, that you read this article later this evening after the show. It also is revealed that the British and other government advice to these activists was to create the events that they could then report on. They're very punctilious about it. Don't wait for events to happen. Create the events, then report them. This is entirely secular. It's more than public relations, because we know what kind of events these were.
That's absolutely right, George. In the documents themselves, these firms boast that we have to create our own events. And as two examples of that, they provide this campaign to try to lift the Syrian government's siege on the city of Homs, which was controlled by these extremist Salafi jihadists that were ethnically cleansing Shia Muslims and put Alawite women and all Alawites from the Muslim minority in prison just because they were the wrong religion. So they took credit for successfully lifting that siege and effectively helping these hardline Salafi jihadist extremists. And then something else that they took credit for is helping to push out this absurd narrative that the secular Syrian government that maintains equal rights for all religious minorities is equal to ISIS. Is the other side of ISIS. And they created this Western government contractor, printed hundreds of thousands of propaganda materials and distributed them throughout Syria. They also worked with a host of Western corporate media outlets, including the BBC, Channel 4, The Guardian, The Times, The New York Times, The Washington Post. They worked with all of these firms, these firms worked with all of these Western corporate media outlets to spread this absurd conspiracy theory, trying to liken the secular Syrian government to ISIS. And we see how effective that disinformation campaign was, because you still hear things like that today. It's absolutely incredible. And we need to keep in mind, again, that when we're talking about these firms, these are Western government intelligence cutouts. So it's not hyperbole to say that the propaganda that we were force-fed in the Western media came directly from the mouths and the minds of Western government intelligence operations.
Yes, men with suits and probably ties, probably based not a few meters from where I'm sitting now, and just across the river, and throughout Whitehall, and in Westminster, men who take the 623 back to some rural idyll outside London and play with their families, were responsible for a public relations machine of immense power, and no sliver of conscience would appear to have flickered across their minds, because we only know this because Anonymous dumped this on us, and because you have the skill and industry to go through enormous amounts of data and bring it to us in the form that you have. We would never have known any of this. We would have suspected it, Ben, you're right, but we could never have proved it. Now we know who these people are and how much they were being paid.
That's absolutely right. And when we're talking about how much they were being paid, we're talking about many millions of British pounds. And keep in mind, of course, this is British taxpayer money that is going to effectively subsidize what are Salafi jihadists. I would also invite people to check out, surprisingly, BBC for once did a pretty good documentary on this. BBC Panorama a few years ago, toward the end of the war, of course, in 2017, they published a documentary called The Jihadis You Fund. And it was about how many of these British government contractors were supporting the civil infrastructure in areas controlled by Al-Qaeda, by Jabhat al-Nusra. It was shocking at the time for much of the British public, but it was something that many of us independent journalists have been saying. And it's something that is still really going on right now inside Idlib with very little attention. But there was one other point that I wanted to stress here, and that's that we're talking about tens of millions of dollars, perhaps hundreds of millions of dollars, tens of millions of British pounds, perhaps hundreds of millions of British pounds that were being spent on these propaganda operations. What also interests me is I think this is just scratching the surface. These are just some documents. The documents appear to have come from either someone in the British Foreign Office who had access to these documents, or they seem to come from people who were involved in these NGO circles who are working with a lot of these contractors. But this is just scratching the surface. This is just talking about one particular aspect of UK Foreign Office contractors. I want to know about what MI6 was doing, what the CIA was doing, what Turkish MIT was doing. There are so many other scandals that need to be uncovered. I think this is just a small percentage of what is, frankly, one of the largest propaganda operations ever constructed in human history. And for nearly a decade, for over 9 years, this propaganda has been constantly bombarded, has been broadcast into our brain 24/7, nonstop. And it's really incredible because these so-called Western democracies from Britain, the United States, other European countries, they claim they have laws that ban intelligence agencies from using propaganda operations against their own domestic population. But what actually was happening here is that we, as taxpayers in the so-called West and in these so-called democracies, we were the targets of a massive psychological warfare campaign by our own governments. It's absolutely incredible.
Yes, and in a normal country, this would be big news, and there would be a serious problem for the government in Westminster and in Washington. But of course, so corrupted has the so-called mainstream media become that this story and this discussion we're going to have now will be completely and utterly ignored by the political class and their media echo chamber. I'm right, haven't I?
Unfortunately, George, you're absolutely right. We've seen on Syria especially the kind of conformity in the media that people talk about in North Korea. You know, we're supposed to believe that all of these other evil boogeymen they brainwash their populations, but the complete uniformity of Western so-called journalists, these stenographers who just march in lockstep with whatever their governments say on Syria or now on Belarus or on Venezuela. I mean, it would make even authoritarian dictators blush. That they would say that that's for them, that's too blatant. So, and the fact that these stories are just totally ignored. It's not just Syria. How many stories right now? Julian Assange is being tortured, put through a show trial, and as you've covered, George, it's been totally ignored by the
Yes.
Western media.
Yes,
It's absolutely. And meanwhile, the Washington Post, which is owned by the richest man on earth, Jeff Bezos. The slogan of the Washington Post has been "Democracy dies in darkness." Well, democracy is dying in broad daylight, and they're not reporting on it.
that brings me to my last question, and I'm grateful as always for your time. We suspected this, now we know it. It is inconceivable that the same kind of operations are not now being used against China, on the Navalny case against Russia, on the Belarus case, who knows, tomorrow perhaps against Armenia, or against any stand that the Russian government might take in relation to Nagorno-Karabakh. These operations just roll on, surely.
That's absolutely right. And it just goes back, of course, hundreds of years, but especially if I'm more familiar with the U.S. model of propaganda. And you can go back, of course, to looking at the Gulf of Tonkin incident with the Vietnam War, where the U.S. lied and claimed that the North Vietnamese were attacking it to justify invading Vietnam. And then you can look at the first Iraq war with the Naira testimony and supposedly Iraqi soldiers were taking Kuwaiti babies out of incubators and leaving them to die. And then you look at the WMD's lies and the lies used to sell the war in Libya. Supposedly Muammar Gaddafi was giving Viagra to his soldiers and encouraging them to rape women. There's constant disinformation campaigns. These are lies that are used not just against captive populations in other countries, but against us ourselves, the taxpayers. And unfortunately, it just continues. And we saw with the second Iraq war and the WMD lies, no one was held to account. In fact, not only were no so-called journalists held accountable, they were rewarded. Many of the same Iraq war boosters who willingly just spread CIA lies, claiming that we were threatened by Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. They're still writing for the New York Times. They're still writing for The Guardian. And they're the same people who are now reporting on Belarus, on China, on Russia, on Venezuela. So it just, all of this shows is that these Western media outlets that claim to be defending democracy, that claim to be providing information, unfortunately, the reality is that they're just propaganda arms of the government, and it's up to us to create our own independent media. And that's why I'm grateful for your show, George. That's why we created The Gray Zone, and you can check out our reporting at thegrayzone.com. And we're going to continue shining the light on these these journalistic abuses because they're not providing news. They're actually mishandling the media.
Ben Norton, you're a star. Shine on. And regards to all of your friends at the Grey Zone. May God strengthen you. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. Who is the least charismatic? Sir Keir Starmer, 51%, quite a commanding lead. Joe Biden, 27%. A block of wood is a decent third at 22%. You can vote on my Twitter feed. Now, I was talking to RT this week for my short. This time, I was going to Barbados on Coconut Airways. Take a look. Coconut Airways going to Barbados. I wish I was. Not least because they're in the news. Why? Because, well, after several centuries, they've decided to become a free republic. Actually, they decided it long ago. In 1998, they decided to move towards republican status. That was itself 30 years, nearly, after they became a supposedly independent country. Now, there are some tears being shed in the gentlemen's clubs in St. James's. Another piece of empire deciding that it's on the way out. And I can understand that. The Queen was a good turn as the head of state of sunny Barbados in the Caribbean Sea, several thousand miles away, but she went on too long, as good turns sometimes do. The truth is, though, that Barbados, like many other parts of the Commonwealth, were betrayed by Britain when we joined the European Union in 1973. These Commonwealth countries that thought that we were their friends for life had the door slammed shut in their face. And I hope now that we have finally left the European Union, we can reconnect with the Commonwealth, whether the Queen is the head of the states of the Commonwealth or not. And of course, most of the biggest and most important Commonwealth countries long ago became republics. What is more sinister is the attempt to blame all of this on China. Yes, unbelievably, China is getting the blame for kicking Her Majesty out of Barbados. Even though China has been involved in the economy and in the defense of Barbados for many years. In fact, China and Barbados signed a defense pact as long ago as 2006. But the Belt and Road Initiative, the new Silk Road, has taken China into the Caribbean, all of the countries of the Caribbean, in a very substantial way, by which I mean China is giving them billions of dollars. It's a long time since Britain gave Barbados any serious money. And China's doing that as part of its Belt and Road Initiative to connect the world. No doubt, of course, the better to sell Chinese products in their countries. But then that's why we went there in the first place a couple of centuries ago. The idea that the Chinese have a particular animus against Her Majesty the Queen is, of course, entirely fanciful. The truth is, China's rise and rise is giving rise to all kinds of unpredictable consequences. Hence, the movement of naval and Air Force assets into the South China Sea. They'll do anything. They'll even pretend to care about Muslims. The whole of the Western world is in an uprising about what is not actually happening to Uyghur Muslims in China, even though the Western world hasn't given a toss about the plight of Muslims in Kashmir, in Yemen, in Libya, in Syria, in Iraq, in all kinds of places where Muslims have been oppressed, even massacred, never mind re-educated when they stray onto the path of extremism. Yeah, they're very concerned about Tibet and the fate of the Dalai Lama, They're even concerned about something called the Falun Gong, which, if it were to take hold in Western countries, would be promptly banned as a religious fanatic sect. They're concerned about anything that will weaken China, and Barbados is just the latest unlikely link in the chain. But the people of Barbados are a fine people, in a fine land, in a fine sea, in a fine part of the world. The future looks bright for them, especially if China, with its rising sun, is shining on them. Me, I'm off to Coconut Airwaves. I'm going to Barbados.
Have something to say? Do you disagree with George? Then call us now and give us your view.
I didn't go, of course, because I'd had to rush back here because I can't possibly miss you on a Sunday. You can call us now. The lines are open. In the UK, 02077 982 255. Tell me what you think of the fact you've been spending a fortune on ISIS and Al-Qaeda's public relations. If you're in the US, 001 757 744 4480. Or you can just tweet me at George Galloway, at RTUK News. Don't forget to include both of us. Chewy Chewbacca says, to be fair, that poll is a bit of an insult to a block of wood. I think so too. Dan says, Sir IKEA wooden top wins by a country mile. American viewers may not yet know just how dire Sir Kaya really is, but they will. And Scouser Lar, my old friend up in Liverpool, says a wet lettuce has more charisma than Keir Starmer. And Attila says a leader doesn't need to be charismatic, just honest and hardworking. Everything Boris Johnson isn't. And Alan says if you put Keir Starmer and Joe Biden back to back, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. Let's take the first call about Joe Biden. It's Taraf in New Orleans. Go ahead, Taraf.
Good evening, Mr. George Galloway. Thank you for taking my call.
A pleasure.
They have video circulating the web right now on Facebook and also Twitter of Joe Biden in early 2016 speaking to Air Force men and women. It's a base overseas, I think in Saudi Arabia somewhere. And he made a joke, and the joke crashed. So he told the servicemen, clap for me, you stupid bastards. Then he said, you dull and you're slow. Wow. At first, I couldn't believe what I was hearing, but when they had a second camera that actually filmed it too, he actually said it. They have one from one angle is under 20 seconds, and another angle is from under 36 seconds.
So
right?
he's not as nice as he looks, which isn't very nice.
No, he's not as nice with his looks. Look, he's not Patton. He's a VP. He gave a command to those troops, all right, to those Air Force. That's why they clapped for him. When he said, you clap for me, you stupid bastards, that's a command. They had to clap for him. And also, okay, I want to tell your audience, underneath your tweet for today, underneath your Twitter account, I put the tweet underneath yours so everybody can go and watch it. And I'm also going to put it underneath RT UK and RT America as well, so everybody can watch it.
I'll try and watch it. I haven't seen it, but I daily see further evidence that Joe Biden is not a block of wood. It's not about his charisma. This man is in full cognitive collapse. I saw a video of him today where the news anchor, after a minute and a half of total agony of Biden not knowing what he was talking about, thumping, face-palming his head because he couldn't remember and couldn't say what it was that he intended to say, the news anchor herself had to come to his rescue and tell him what it was that he was supposed to be saying. I saw a video this week of him doing an interview in which he stops and says, oh, I missed that line. He's actually got an auto cue during news interviews. How can this man possibly debate a gorilla like Donald Trump on Tuesday?
Exactly, sir. They might have to replace him. I don't think he can make it to November 3rd because the more they interview him, the worse he gets. I'm talking about the worse he gets. So maybe Hillary or maybe someone else or Kamala Harris. I don't know.
Well, Taraf, I think you may be onto something there. I did say many times myself that this was a maneuver to retire poor old Joe, can no longer cut it. We're going to have to put in, it would now be, I presume, Kamala Harris, about whom we know next to nothing, who dropped out of the Democratic Party's primaries before a single vote had been cast. So she had 0% of the Democratic primary vote, catapulted into the presidential spot. Taraf in New Orleans, thank you very much. Mike is in Nassau. Got to go there, never been there. Mike, go ahead.
Hi, how are you?
By the grace of God, I'm good. Grateful for your call. Go ahead.
I want to talk about the U.S. election. Because I've been an expat for 22 years, I get a mail-in ballot emailed to me. And I filled it out, and the Bahama Post is not delivering abroad because of pandemic. So what happened was I had to fax in my vote, and I had to sign a waiver that my ballot would not be secret because obviously it's a fax so they could see it. And my ballot was rejected because of the signature. And I have a feeling it would not have been rejected had I voted for Trump. But that would be impossible to prove.
This whole mail-in thing is going to scupper the whole election, isn't it? I mean, I take your point. You were a Biden voter. I saw a picture earlier this evening of someone dumping in the trash 4 or 5 votes for Trump. Opened, dumped in the trash.
I can't make a comment about that. I didn't see it. But the strange thing is the Orlando Sentinel said that so far there have been 33,000 ballots rejected on signature, which seems awfully high number since voting just started last week. But they didn't tell which signatures were being rejected, whether they were for Trump or for Biden.
Well,
it just seems a little
I have no doubt at all that both parties will be seeking to manipulate the process. I'm sure they always have, but given the stakes in this ballot, I'm sure that it will go into overdrive. But we heard from someone a week or two ago on the phone, I think, that what's likely to happen, Mike, is that the Republicans will vote in person en masse, and therefore the exit polls on the night will look like a big victory for Donald Trump, and the Democrats will vote by post, and the post will not be counted perhaps for weeks, and in any case will be subject to massive manipulation. Thus, the whole thing ending up just like 2000 in the Supreme Court. Is that how it looks to you?
Yes, but there also may be a surprise because this Tuesday is the first debate, and I have a feeling that Biden is going to be crucified. That's just my opinion. I don't think the man knows where he is, but we'll see.
Mike, thanks very much for that call from Nassau, which I now know is in the Bahamas. I was going to ask him where it is. Who is the least charismatic? Sir Keir Starmer, 55%. Joe Biden, 26%. A block of wood is plummeting, 19%. Although someone asked on Twitter, what kind of wood is it? Now, in the second hour, we have the great Max Kaiser. There have been many historic occasions in the British Parliament, but I can say I took part in one of them. People queued in the snow, outside, in their hundreds, maybe more, to hear Max Kaiser and me together speaking in the Westminster Hall about politics, about economics, and most of them were there to hear Max. This man, when he was in Britain, took the country by storm. He's still on 3 times a week, at least on RT. Many of you love his show. I never miss it myself. He is a communicator on another level from any other economist, any other economic commentator I have ever heard. He makes economics come to life. And Max and I had this meeting, and hundreds were turned away because the venue could not possibly have taken any more people. It's still available on YouTube. You should check it out sometime. The great Max Kaiser is up after the news. But let's squeeze in a call from Julian in London. Go ahead, Julian.
Hello, George. I wanted to get through to you a while back when you did the 9/11 anniversary.
Yes, we're going to do it again when we start the midweek Moats Extra.
No problem.
We're going to have a big debate on it.
I'd love to get involved, and I'll just do a little interlude to that maybe. In 1946, when the King David Hotel was blown up in Jerusalem, the bombers entered the building dressed as Arabs. Similar operations were carried out in Egypt when Western targets were attacked by Zionist agents posing as Arabs. You mentioned that in 1967, when the USS Liberty was attacked by the Israeli military, at first they tried to blame it on Arabs. And there's a whole wing of the IDF called the Mustat Revim, whose job it is to impersonate Arabs in order to infiltrate and instigate in the West Bank. So it's not out of the question, as 5 Israelis were arrested in New York on 9/11, bombs and box cutters that were used, the same weapon apparently used in the that at the very least we could say there was perhaps foreknowledge of the 9/11 attack.
Look, we'll deal with all of those angles, as well as the engineering and architectural angles, when we devote more or less a whole show to this in the next few weeks. But I've got to put this to you, Julian. We know that 11 out of the 19 of the hijackers were Saudi Arabian citizens. We know that because they enrolled in flying schools throughout the United States of America. We saw them going through security immediately prior to boarding those aeroplanes. We know that the Al-Qaeda leadership of Osama bin Laden congratulated his brothers on bringing down the Twin Towers. So I'm not raining on your parade. You'll get another chance to parade the points that you've made. But Saudi Arabian Islamist fanatics were definitely on board the planes that I saw with my own eyes hitting the Twin Towers. They were not Israelis. They were Arabs. They weren't just dressed as Arabs. They really were Arabs. That's all I've got to say at this stage on that. Pete says, I'm not surprised, but I'm absolutely fuming about what the document dump suggests. The question is this: why? Who was to benefit from the fake news? And Rob says, with Brexit almost done, and if Trump secures a second mandate, it's surely reasonable to think that the UK will also leave NATO, which is falling apart anyway. Will the UK then become a fully fledged vassal state of the United States of America? And Ben on YouTube says, so this police officer was shot dead by a handcuffed man, then he managed to shoot himself. Will we ever see the CCTV? A very good question. So the great Max Kaiser is up after the news, so don't dare switch off. If you do, you'll regret it, perhaps forever, as those hundreds who were turned away that night in the Houses of Parliament are still regretting that they didn't get there early enough to see the great man in person. It's first, the news though, with Jamie Lowe.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
3 more counties in Wales are to be placed under local lockdowns from tomorrow evening. The Welsh Government has announced Neath, Port Talbot, Torfan and Vale of Glamorgan will have tighter COVID-19 restrictions. It means that half of Wales's 22 local authority areas will be under local lockdowns as rules come into force in Cardiff and Swansea this afternoon. Almost 2 million people in Wales, 2/3 of the population, will be under local lockdowns. Welsh local lockdown rules mean extended households must end and people are not allowed to leave or enter locked down areas without a reasonable excuse. The COVID-19 outbreak in Scotland is now being driven by infections among teenagers, figures show. More than 43% of the positive cases detected on Thursday were in the 15 to 19 age group, according to data published by Public Health Scotland. Infection rates in this age group were stable throughout the summer but began to rise sharply from mid-September. Public health teams are dealing with several outbreaks among students living in shared accommodation. The largest outbreak is at the University of Glasgow, where 172 students have tested positive. Britain's Culture Secretary has defended students going back to university in England. Oliver Dowden said it was important students did not give up a year of their life by not going. Labour has called on the government to consider pausing the return after COVID outbreaks meant thousands of students had to isolate in their accommodation. Dowden said, "Young people have paid a huge price during this crisis, and I think it's only fair to try and get them back. We have got clear guidelines for them to follow." However, a scientist who advises the government said the situation was inevitable. Professor Mark Woolhouse, who sits on the government's pandemic modelling group, said the situation was entirely predictable and had been modelled. He also said that students were not to blame for outbreaks, and with students converging from areas around the country, it was inevitable there would be some spread. Modelling showed the risk areas were first-year halls of residence and face-to-face teaching. The Labour Party is very sympathetic to a bid by Conservative MPs to increase parliamentary scrutiny over coronavirus restrictions in England. Shadow Justice Secretary David Lammy has said. Senior Tory rebel Sir Graham Brady has tabled an amendment which would allow MPs to vote on changes to lockdown rules. Several Tory MPs and the Lib Dems have also signalled support for the move. The government says it wants to work with MPs while ensuring ministers can react quickly to suppress the virus. It also has said that MPs will get a chance to vote retrospectively on the rule of 6, which puts a limit on the number of people at social gatherings. A man has been arrested on suspicion of supplying a firearm following the fatal shooting of a police officer in a UK custody suite. Sergeant Matt Ratana died in hospital after being shot at Croydon Custody Centre in South London in the early hours of Friday. The arrest took place in Norwich around 2 a.m. this morning, and the suspect is currently being detained at a South London police station. Meanwhile, the suspect for the Ratana shooting remains in a critical condition in hospital, and officers say they have not yet been able to speak to him. US President Donald Trump has nominated Amy Coney Barrett, a favourite of social conservatives, to be the new Supreme Court Justice. Speaking by her side at the White House Rose Garden, Trump described her as a woman of unparalleled achievement. If confirmed by senators, Judge Barrett will replace Liberal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died recently, aged 87. The nomination will spark a bitter confirmation fight in the Senate as November's presidential election looms. Clashes have erupted between Armenian and Azerbaijani forces in the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region, with civilian deaths reported by both sides. Armenia said Azerbaijan had launched an air and artillery attack. It later declared martial law and total military mobilization. Azerbaijan blamed Armenia and said it was responding to shelling along the whole front. The long-running conflict has flared up again in recent months. And finally, the son of the late motorbike stunt rider Evel Knievel is suing Disney over a daredevil character in the animated film Toy Story 4. Kelly Knievel has held the publicity rights to his father's name since 1998, according to his US District Court filing in Las Vegas. The federal trademark infringement lawsuit claims that Disney-owned Pixar did not ask permission to use his father's likeness when creating the character Duke Kaboom. Knievel is seeking damages of more than $300,000 over allegations including false endorsement and unjust enrichment. He said Evel Knievel did not thrill millions around the world, break bones, and spill his blood just so Disney could make a bunch of money. An Evel Knievel toy was released in 1973 with a white helmet and jumpsuit with a motorbike that could be propelled with a wind-up device. Disney and Pixar released a similar Duke Kaboom toy along with Toy Story 4 when the film came out last year. A Disney spokesman described Knievel's claims as meritless, saying the film company will defend itself vigorously. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Max Kaiser extraordinaire up in a minute or two, but we are taking calls, of course. Let me remind you the number 02077 982 255. You can call us from the US on 001 757 744 4480. Tweet me at George Galloway, at RTUK News. You can still vote on this poll. Who is the least charismatic? A, Sir Keir Starmer. B, Joe Biden. C, a block of wood. Inexplicably, the block of wood is plummeting in the polls. Now, Max Kaiser is a clan chief in Scotland. He has an ancestral home. I'm trying to get his castle back, not least because there's actually a vacancy for the chief of the Galloway clan. And as I'm now living in Galloway, and I'm possibly the best known Galloway anywhere, I'm running for that office as clan chief so that me and Max can form a new clan front in the south of Scotland. Even though we disagree on much, he is just irreplaceable, unrepeatable. They threw away the mold when they made Max Kaiser, who joins me now. Max, how wonderful. Tell me, how's my investment doing? You told me to get into Bitcoin at under $10. What is it standing at now?
Oh, George, it's around $10,000 now. And, a lot of people we told about Bitcoin at $10. And, thank God now I've got all the capital I need to take back my castle, Caverlock Castle, as part of being the new chief of the Maxwell clan. And, we're all about Reveresco. That's the motto of the Maxwell clan, Reveresco. We will rise again. We've been doing battle with England for hundreds of years, George, and we're going to win this time.
Now, we'll come back to our clan future, but you're sitting now, and we miss you terribly, in the United States of America, which seems to have gone berserk. Cities are burning, two scarcely alive, or one scarcely sentient and the other scarcely alive, are doing battle for the US presidency. Your unemployment rate is rapidly reaching the levels of the 1930s. Depression. What on earth is going to happen in the United States?
Right. Well, you have, I cover two major threads, really, George. I cover mostly economics. And as you know, we've been covering Bitcoin now for almost 10 years, and we see Bitcoin being adopted all over the world in places like Iran and Venezuela, and it's transforming the global economy. And I think that's a huge story, and it's just getting bigger every day. Here in the United States, we have a meltdown on the left-wing political side of the spectrum. Hillary Clinton, she never accepted her loss in 2016, and she's poisoned the political environment completely since then. And as a result, they don't really have a viable candidate in 2020. Trump looks like he's, the guy who's going to win this election. And, this is heading right into some major economic developments, and COVID-19 and all these things are happening. But I think to describe the political climate, to give it a kind of encapsulate what's going on here, is that the Democrats wasted 4 years chasing the Russiagate hoax, which has now been proven to be a hoax, and they're going into this election underarmed, without much really behind them, and so they really blew it. They spent all their political capital on that Russiagate hoax, and now it looks like they're not really going to do much in this election either, George.
Now the debate's coming up between the gorilla Donald Trump and the almost corpse-like Joe Biden. That must be ex-certificate, surely. You mustn't let children watch that one.
Well, in the case of Joe Biden, I really feel this might be becoming a case of elder abuse. Many of us who have had parents who start to lose their cognitive abilities, they need care, and they need love, and they need help, and they need medical attention. But to put somebody like this, who looks like they're having cognitive problems, and it's rapidly getting worse. And this is also very symptomatic of that issue, is that once it starts to go downhill, it picks up pace, and it becomes quite a problem. And to put him out there like a punching bag, really, and he doesn't even know where he is sometimes, that's abusive. And again, I don't know what the Democrats, it's not a good look for the Democrats. They don't have any compassion at all for this poor guy. He really needs medical attention.
Unless, of course, it's all a plan to replace him at the last minute with Harris or maybe even Clinton. Is that a possibility? Is that a conspiracy theory too far?
Well, given his health conditions, I think that's an open question, and it's a good question. But again, just to stick on this point of being elder abuse, he has served in Washington for decades, and he should go out more honorably than this, being used as a freak show. It's almost like dragging the Elephant Man out during a freak show, and everyone, gawking and laughing. And it's very, very sad. As far as doing a last-minute replacement with Clinton or, Kamala Harris, seems she's teed up to be ready to step in. They're playing. Okay, let's game that out a little bit. And the Democrats have shown remarkable inability to outgame Donald Trump. Donald Trump is somebody that is always one or two steps ahead of the Democrats. I'm sure the Republicans and Donald Trump have already worked through every possible scenario that the Democrats are going to throw at him, and he's got a response. As Trump said when he became president, he's a counterpuncher, right? He's a counterpuncher. He strategizes. He waits for you to make a move, and then he punches. And he's got thousands of lawyers set up all over the country ready for this election. He's got the bully pulpit of the presidency in the White House. He uses it very, very effectively. He's brilliant on television. He's got brilliant marketing. He's got some legislative wins that he can point to. And so, again, whatever the dirty tricks the Democrats are planning, I think they're going up against a guy who's seen it all for decades.
Well, he's also got some of the most gun-crazed people in America in his base. It's I think, a hypothesis worth exploring. If Joe Biden or the Democrats were to defeat Donald Trump, he's already made it clear this week that he can't guarantee that he'll go peacefully from the White House, not least because they may well come after him legally. He might be the next victim of a Mueller-type inquiry. Is it possible that this could snarl up so badly with the mail voting, with the vote on the day being heavily Trump because the Republicans are voting in person, but then as the postal votes begin to get counted and contested, the Democrats themselves claiming victory? Could this become a shooting war, Max?
Well, I think let's unpack that a little bit. You're covering a lot of ground there. So first of all, I think this election obviously is going to be highly contentious. Okay, that's a given. Number two, I think that the next day after the election, we won't have a winner, a clear winner. There will be, as you say, postal votes have got to come in, and it will be contested in many states, and we've seen that already several times. Remember the hanging chads when George W. won his election against Al Gore. It was contested, and it went to the Supreme Court. And I think that's why the Supreme Court nomination announced this week, and they're going to get that. It looks like they're going to have a vote on that before the election. This is very important because the election will go to the results look like there's a probability that they will go to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court will make a decision. So as far as then, will we have some sort of coup attempt, I guess you could call it. And on one hand, you could say, you know what, that sounds a bit outlandish. But then again, George, in 2016, when Trump was sworn into office, we now know, it's been fully documented and researched, that the Obama team and the Clinton team attempted a coup in America of Trump in 2016. And they set up Flynn in a way that we now know was completely bogus. They hired Steele in the UK to put out the Steele dossier, which was completely bogus. And they pulled out all the dirty tricks, and they attempted a coup in 2016. So will the Democrats attempt a coup in 2021? Well, they've already done it in 2016. So I'd have to say that they've shown their colors. We know that they're capable of doing it. On the other hand, if the Supreme Court comes down and says that Trump lost, I'm sure Trump will follow this constitutional mandate and make way for the next administration.
Let's talk about the economy, which is your main field of endeavor. Am I right in saying that the United States is now facing sweeping unemployment, sweeping evictions of people who can't pay the rent, the landlords having to evict them, having to take action because the banks to whom they are in hock are closing in on them for repayment of their loans? How precarious is the U.S. economy right now?
It's about 10 to 20 times worse than we saw in 2008, right? So in 2008, when you had the global financial crisis, which was caused by the banks on Wall Street by over-leveraging the economy until it snapped and it broke, we said that you needed reform. You needed to rein these banks in. You needed to put some bankers in jail because they were committing massive fraud. But instead, what we heard from Obama and Eric Holder was his doctrine, where banks are too big to prosecute. Bankers are strategic elements of the economy, and we can't put them in jail. And they expanded their credit line 10 to 20 times. And the banks did exactly the same thing now for the last 12 years that they did that led up to the 2008 crash. And now we got the 2020 crash, which was very predictable. I said on my show, I said within 10 to 12 years, you'll have a repeat, but it'll be a lot worse. So did a few other folks out there who follow what's happening in the global economy. But and to give you an idea of some of the numbers here, if you remember back in 2008, the subprime market for housing was one of the major causes of that crash. And that was, let's call it there was a $1 trillion industry that blew up overnight, and that caused ripple effects. Well, right now we find out that the commercial real estate market, which is a $17 trillion market, a third to 40% they're in arrears. And that looks like a $5 trillion or more collapse that's unfolding in real time before our eyes. So that obviously means that most banks and insurance companies in America are technically insolvent. But this is also true around the world. It's also true in the UK. What the U.S. has that nobody else has in the world is they still are the world reserve currency, the U.S. dollar, and the Federal Reserve Bank has the ability to print money. And they've been printing money by the trillion every week and every month. They've printed tens of trillions of dollars to keep these institutions afloat like they did in 2008, but they've done it now on a much grander scale. So the question, therefore, is who's going to be the big loser on this new global financial crisis part 2 from what we saw in 2008? The U.S., because they do have that money printer and they still have a global empire of debt that's managed through Washington and Wall Street. They still have the ability to print themselves a lot of money here in the U.S. Other countries we see are strangled to death from liquidity. So obviously you see in Venezuela, that whole area of the world is starving of cash. Argentina, they're entering hyperinflation because their economies are so dire. We see problems in Iran. We see problems also in China. China is facing huge credit problems and credit collapse. So it's a question of the cleanest shirt in the laundry, right? The cleanest shirt in the laundry is still the United States in a very dirty basket of laundry. In the UK, it looks pretty bad because you've got COVID, you've got GDP down sharply, and, of course, Brexit is still not resolved, and it looks like a no-deal Brexit, which is problematic for the economy. And I've always said with the Brexit that it would cause economic hardship. And the response I always got back from the British people that I know and talk to, the response was always that we value our sovereignty more than we do our financial well-being, and we're willing to take a financial hit for our sovereignty, as that term was being used. And so now you're going to experience it. You're going to experience a Brexit-related financial hit with the COVID hit combined, and it's going to be very challenging. But you will have a different political situation to wave the flag. And we'll see how that works out, George.
Yeah, I'm not much into flags, as you know, but let's, before we leave the US dollar, the cleanest shirt in a dirty basket of laundry, there must come a point, mustn't there, when the fundamentals of the US economy, its level of indebtedness, begin to lose the affection or addiction to the dollar as a world reserve currency amongst the rest of the world. China and Russia are increasingly trading with each other in their own local currencies. Iran is trading with China in its own local currency. Moves are being made to set up a parallel SWIFT system for international transactions which don't include the dollar. Is the dollar going to be the king forever?
I would say the short answer would be no. And you're absolutely right that the rest of the world is de-dollarizing, and they are doing bilateral trades in their own currencies, bypassing the dollar. And if you look at the markets, they do give you a clue what's going on. So the U.S. dollar itself has been trading down more or less, but in the last couple of weeks, when more political crises are erupting, you see the dollar trade up. So that shows you that people around the world, their reflex is to buy dollars during crisis. And that's been with us since World War II. So a lot of people talk a big game, but when you have a crisis, people go to the most liquid, biggest traded currency in the world, the U.S. dollar. And you see that reflected in the price. The price of the dollar goes up. Now, I would look a little bit deeper to get a broader sense of what the bigger trends are. And so for that, you just have to look at the price of gold and look at price of gold in all various currencies. So gold has made new highs against all currencies starting more than 2 years ago. And it just made a new all-time high against the dollar within the past 6 months to a year. So that tells you that the big guns are positioning themselves in gold out of the dollar because the dollar and the gold are mutually exclusive. They trade opposite of each other. Additionally, and this is where Bitcoin comes in, many people who buy gold are now equating gold with Bitcoin, and they are buying Bitcoin. So you have Paul Tudor Jones, who's a major hedge fund guy in America. I've followed his career for decades. He's been buying Bitcoin. He says it's superior to gold. It's the fastest horse in the race. You have a big company here in America called MicroStrategy, run by a guy named Michael Saylor, who just put almost $500 million of the company's treasury out of cash, out of dollars, into Bitcoin. This is really a shot to start a boardroom revolution in America where companies with huge cash positions start to diversify out of the dollar for the reasons you just said and into something that protects them from the inflation and the money printing. And there's only two choices. There's gold and Bitcoin is an obvious superior choice in that situation, and that's where people are moving their capital. So corporations are moving that way. In the case of the sovereign level, we see countries like Iran come out and saying we're actually going to start subsidize Bitcoin mining, and we're going to start building a position in Bitcoin as a way to work around the sanctions and to bolster our own economy, which makes perfect sense for a country like that to want to be in a censorship-proof, unconfiscatable, hard money like Bitcoin. So the light bulb has gone off, and that's the direction that they're going. Same thing in Venezuela. They are tiptoeing their way into Bitcoin. They introduced their own currency, the Petro, which was kind of an interim step. There's some obvious limitations to that, and now they're heading into the primary of all, and that is Bitcoin. There's several countries now. Belarus is actually involved to some degree. All these countries that are on the periphery of the American empire that are essentially falling out of the empire, the influence of the empire, they realize that to truly divest themselves from the dollar, they need their own hard currency. And that means that it cannot be a fiat currency. It has to be hard money. There's only two choices, gold and Bitcoin. And Bitcoin is emerging really as the go-to hard money for corporations, sovereigns, and individuals to protect themselves against all this money printing, George.
Finally, and I'm grateful for your time, Max, as always, what would be the tipping point? Would it be China moving into Bitcoin in a big way? Would that tip the balance against the dollar and against gold?
That would certainly tip the balance against the dollar. But I think in the case of the dollar, it's a war of attrition. If you look at the total amount of trade in the world and what percentage of it is U.S. dollar based, it is gone from a post-war high of 80% or so down to under 60%. It's getting close to that magical 50% number. Once you drop below 50%, it's an easy trade. You can easily say, hey, you know what? The dollar, it's no longer got a majority of global trade, and we've got to start taking actions. And then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. People start to protect themselves against the dollar. They start buying gold and Bitcoin. The price of gold and Bitcoin start moving up, which attracts more people to buy gold and Bitcoin. And where's the source of those funds? The dollar. So they're short dollar, long gold and Bitcoin. And once that self-feeding frenzy takes over, then everything happens pretty quickly. People always ask me, when should I buy gold? When should I buy Bitcoin? It's better to be a year early than a day too late.
Well, good advice. I'm glad I took it. The legend, Max Kaiser of RT. 3 times a week, Max. Still, yeah?
Yeah, we're going very strong, and we're dubbed into Spanish, which is getting incredible attention. And also, we have got a new podcast called the Orange Pill Podcast that we do several times a week, and it's gaining a lot of attention, a lot of traction. People love it.
Fantastic. Check it out if you haven't. Max and his good lady, his good wife, Stacey. As a double act, they're even better than Max is on his own. Max Kaiser, thank you for joining us. Who is the least charismatic? Keir Starmer's winning it out the park. Joe Biden's second place, the block of wood, just under 20%. You can still vote until 9 o'clock on that on my Twitter feed. Now, if you'd like to comment on anything that I have said this evening or my guests have said this evening on Syria, on Bitcoin, on Donald Trump, on Joe Biden, the lines are now open. So call in now. We're taking your calls right the way through to 9 o'clock. Let me take a 1 minute break. Call me. Come and have a go if you think you're hard enough. Don't bring up a false name. Come on air. Call me and let's have this matter out.
Let's get ready to rumble!
How do you know the nerve to tell people to Brexit if you're not telling them the repercussions?
That's 2016's argument, Michael. I'm no longer arguing with you about the merits of Brexit. I'm arguing with you about democracy, about the right of the majority to have their decision, their vote implemented.
This match will get red hot.
Not have a referendum. Let them have a referendum. Let them sort it out amongst themselves.
I want a referendum. Robert, I want a referendum. Let me put that in capital letters. If you think this year of 2020, which is shaping up already to be an annus miserabilis for the SNP, if you think this is your year, go ahead. Come on. Let's have it out.
It's on.
But no, George, it's not as simple as that, right? Have you seen the documentary about Cambridge Analytica and the people who work there? Have you looked at the global
I know nothing about
impact?
them. I'm not interested in them.
Precisely. But
I'm not interested in them, Bruce, because it's all a red herring, just like Russiagate was a red herring.
You're up.
Do you only want to hear voices that agree with you? Because if you do, you're not clever enough to be at this open university of the airwaves. In fact, you need to go back to remedial and learn something about what democracy and freedom of speech actually mean.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
Now, this is where I look back at the 7 days in history, the monumental and significant events for good or for ill, which have shaped our world. This is the week. It was on this day in 1968, the American hippie musical Hair opened in London, 1 day after the abolition of theatre censorship. I can actually remember that. And pictures of the cast naked on the stage, covered, of course, with a kind of big sticker at the strategically important parts. Hair. I'm told it was damned awful as a musical, but it certainly made people's hair stand on end at the time. Some of the scenes, written by two out-of-work actors, wouldn't have been allowed on stage the day before. It contained nudity and drug-taking, as well as a strong anti-war message at the height of the Vietnam War, and also featured the desecration of the American flag. It was the day when sprinter Ben Johnson, remember him, was sent home from the 1988 Seoul Olympic Games in disgrace. The Canadian was also stripped of his 100-meter gold medal after testing positive for drugs. It didn't stop him. He began racing again in January 1991, but he never regained the form that had made him the fastest man in the world. No surprises there. He wasn't allowed to take drugs. In January 1993, he tested positive again for steroids at an indoor meeting in Montreal. The International Association of Athletics Federations banned him from competition for life. I wonder where he is now. And in 1996, this week, the Afghan capital, Kabul, fell to the Taliban after 3 days of fierce fighting. Mullah Omar's barbaric grip on the country ended after the 9/11 attacks on the United States, which was blamed on one of his house guests, Osama bin Laden. The opposition Northern Alliance, with US backing, marched into the capital in November 2001. It's worked out, isn't it? They're about to march back. On the 28th of the month in 1964, the Warren Commission concluded there was no conspiracy surrounding the assassination of President Kennedy the year before, and that gunman Lee Harvey Oswald acted alone. Well, of course he did, setting off one of the world's longest running conspiracy theories. We'll have to do that on Moats Extra too, the Kennedy assassination. In 1995, in this week, in Washington, Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization agreed a deal giving the Palestinians control over much of the West Bank. Yitzhak Rabin and Yasser Arafat put their names to the 400-page agreement in a low-key ceremony in the East Room of the White House. Just a month later, Rabin was assassinated by a Jewish extremist. Shimon Peres pushed on with Rabin's efforts to make peace with the Palestinians, it says here. But in the 1996 election, he lost to Benjamin Netanyahu, who campaigned against the program and who's been in power ever since, 25 years on. Still no peace, still no justice. It was all ramped up in 2000 when Palestinians and Israeli police clashed in the worst violence for several years at Jerusalem's holiest site, the compound around the Al-Aqsa Mosque. The violence began after an inflammatory tour of the mosque by the hardline then Israeli opposition leader Ariel Sharon. This week in 1960, the Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev disrupted a meeting of the United Nations General Assembly with several angry outbursts. Twice he pounded his desk and twice he shouted interruptions to show his disapproval at the way UN forces had intervened in the assassination and the eventual overthrow of the government there of Patrice Lumumba in the Belgian Congo. Just a week later, Khrushchev caused uproar when he famously used his shoe to bang on the desk after the Philippine delegate accused the USSR of imperialism in Eastern Europe. I will remember, I was only 6, but I remember Khrushchev's shoe being banged on the desk because I was that kind of kid. On the 30th of September in 1938, Britain's Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, arrived back in the UK holding an agreement signed by Adolf Hitler, which stated the German leader's desire never to go to war with Britain again. Oh no! Chamberlain declared the accord with the Germans signalled peace in our time. And after he'd read it to a jubilant crowd gathered at Heston Airport in West London. You don't need to be a student of history to know what followed. But if you are a student of history, you'll definitely want my debut novel, which is called Bayswater. It's called Queensway, I beg your pardon. Maybe the second one will be called Bayswater. The second one will be out actually in November. But Queensway, it's cheap, $4.99. It's a quick read because it's a series, probably a 5-parter, which one day, I hope, will end up on the big screen. There's the book on the small screen now. In 1955, Hollywood actor James Dean was killed when his sports car was involved in a head-on collision with another vehicle driven by Donald Turnipseed. Is that a joke? Is that his name? Donald Turnipseed. My goodness. In 1988, a Gibraltar court ruled the killing of 3 unarmed IRA suspects by British SAS soldiers was lawful. Of course. The jury took less than 7 hours to reach the 9-2 verdict on the shootings in March of 1988. And on the 1st of October in 1957, a vaccine against the strain of influenza that was sweeping around the world was made available to the British public. The so-called Asian flu pandemic had killed thousands of people around the globe. Around 100,000 people died worldwide, which is almost as nothing, I'm afraid, compared to the present pandemic. I've asked the Russians if I can take the Sputnik vaccine. After all, I'm working every day on RT. If I get sick, I can't work, the program falls, and I'm hoping to be able to report a successful vaccination by the vaccine Sputnik in the next week or so. In fact, why don't I get the vaccine here live on air? I see the director waving jubilantly. Would you like to see me get the vaccine here live on air? If the Russians will administer it, I'll agree to it. Anyway, this was also the week in 1975 of the thriller in Manila, when Muhammad Ali retained the World Heavyweight Boxing Championship after defeating his arch-rival, Joe Frazier, in the third and arguably greatest fight. I saw it in a cinema in Blackpool in the middle of the night. I would say it's the greatest fight of all time, wouldn't you? It lasted 14 rounds before Joe Frazier's trainer, Eddie Fuchs, finally persuaded him to call it a day. Ali said the fight was the closest thing to dying. And finally, in 1983, the so-called dream ticket, nightmare ticket of Neil Kinnock and Deputy Roy Hattersley won the Labour leadership election. It didn't take long to turn into a nightmare. Kinnock led Labour into its 4th consecutive election defeat in 1992. The present Labour leader, the wooden Keir Starmer, can and probably will top that dismal record of failure. He's winning that poll out the park. Unless you want to see a big change in that, you've only got about 10 minutes to tweet on that. It's on my Twitter feed. Keir Starmer's winning it out the park. Let's take some calls from MI-SSI-PI, Mississippi. Patrick, go ahead, Patrick.
Hey, Mr. Galloway, this is Patrick McCarty calling you. I'm originally from Louisiana, but I'm living in Mississippi now, and it's been far too long since we last spoke.
Wonderful. Go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to call because, of course, I'm sure you heard or you saw yesterday Trump's appointment of Barrett, Amy Coney Barrett. To the United States
it's a nomination.
Court.
It's a nomination at this stage, isn't it?
It's an appointment. That's correct. She's been appointed. She hasn't been confirmed yet, so she's just a nominee.
Yeah.
We'll have to wait and see until I think it's October the 12th is when her confirmation hearing will begin.
That's going to be a hot potato, Patrick, isn't it?
It certainly will, yes, sir. And the Republicans have a slim majority in the Senate anyway, and they may have some defections. It's going to be interesting to see how Romney votes, Murkowski of Alaska, Susan Collins of Maine. You may see some defections within the Republican ranks as it relates to this appointment. But this is what concerns me, Mr. Galloway. I don't know if you've heard about this, but I read, I think it was last night or the night before, that there is some discussion about possibly amending the Constitution so that appointments or Supreme Court justices aren't permitted to serve on the court for life.
In other words, they'll be term limited. Doesn't that make sense? Never a good idea giving someone a job for life.
I agree. And it's, it's very difficult to amend the Constitution. It's a very cumbersome process. That's the only problem. It may take some time. I think it's a great proposal, though, because it's been, like it or not, it's because, the Supreme Court, the judicial branch has become so politicized now, whereas, one justice can pretty much has all the power, in the country. I mean, this is what we're seeing. One judicial
for me, on this side, we don't even know the names of any of our judges, and they rise imperceptibly. There's no big hoo-ha when they are appointed to be judges. But it seems to me a major democratic deficit that so many things are in the hands of a group of judges who are appointed by politicians, and obviously oftentimes will have a political bias. It's the Parliament that should make the laws. It's the Parliament that should make the decisions, the Parliament being Congress in your case, and the President also. Giving all that power to judges seems to me a profoundly unhealthy idea.
I completely agree. I think Congress has been derelict in its duty to ensure that laws are enacted and enforced. The Supreme Court, the judicial branch, only interprets the Constitution. It doesn't make law, or in theory it shouldn't. Of course, that has changed for quite some time because the judicial branch has become a de facto second legislative branch, which I think is a crying shame. But I believe that in a lot of cases, Democratic and Republican presidents alike have only chosen or selected justices who go along with either the a hard left or hard right agenda, as opposed to selecting someone who is a really great, keen judicial mind who deserves to be on the court based on merit. And I think that, you look at Clarence Thomas, certainly the late Antonin Scalia, the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg now, they were so, either on the extreme left or the extreme right in terms of their jurisprudence, to the point where they have pretty much, the whole idea of, what makes a Supreme Court justice has changed.
Now, one of the things I noticed, Patrick, there may be many good reasons not to vote for this woman, this latest appointment. But some of the reasons I saw alarmed me, given my background and faith, that because she's a Roman Catholic, she cannot be trusted, and that along with Kavanaugh, that'll be two Catholics, too many Catholics. Is this going to be an issue?
7 of 9 justices of the United, if she's confirmed, 7 of the 9 justices in the Supreme Court are Catholic, which is mind-boggling to think.
Well, thank God for that, I say.
Oh, well, I agree. As a Catholic myself, I agree.
I'm only concerned about the other two.
Amazing to think.
I'm concerned about the other two.
Exactly. Well, the other two are Jewish. You have no Protestants on the Supreme Court, and to think,
wow.
At one time it was overwhelmingly a Protestant WASP institution.
And is that going to become an issue in this confirmation?
I think that her faith could very well become something of an issue, particularly when it pertains, quite frankly, to Roe versus Wade and abortion. It's such a hot-button issue, and she's definitely to be pressed on it. And her faith and her, it certainly reflects her jurisprudence. Because think about it, her mentor, she clerked for Antonin Scalia. That was her mentor, and she appears to be kind of a chip off the old block, so to speak,
You see, there's a good example, Patrick. It's cowardly of the politicians to leave to the court the decisions about abortion in America. This is a matter that should be fought out politically, and people should stand or fall in the Congress and in the White House on where they stand on that issue. Instead of legislating on these things, including and other things like gay rights and so on, they defer to the court, which is a coward's way out, isn't it?
It is a coward's way out, but I think politically it's perhaps can be interpreted or looked upon as astute on their part, because they can just it's like kicking the can down the road, right?
Yeah.
Because, it's a hot-button issue, or we'll just defer to the courts so we can win re-election. it's all about the preservation of power as far as the legislative branch is concerned.
Patrick, as always, a pleasure talking with you. Thank you for that. James is in Canada. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, James.
Oh, George, I have a couple of points.
Yeah.
One is it's about 75 years since I last fired a machine gun. And what I wanted to say is that the newsreels of the wars in Lebanon and Syria and anywhere else, those newsreels, I think, are faked. And they're faked because they have the machine gunner with his rifleman run out from behind a nice safe wall to the middle of the street, and then he puts his gun up to his shoulder and sprays a bunch of bullets up the street. There's nobody there. He's not shooting at anybody at all. It's all fakery.
No, I agree with that.
You get my
I've
point?
seen them. Actually, I've seen them with my own eye doing that. It's the equivalent of the politician waving to the non-existent voter on the horizon. A lot of these clips of people running into the middle of the road, which is a very stupid thing to do anyway. Far better to stay behind the wall and letting loose half a magazine for the camera. Of course, that's faked.
It's a photo opportunity. That's all it is.
Yeah, and the media actively conspires with it. I recall vividly the Sky News in particular racing up the highway to Benghazi with the Islamist fanatics who were chanting in Arabic, blood-curdling cries, which the Sky News reporter didn't seem to understand. And she was so excited about them. Little did she know that the day would come when they'd be looking to cut her head off.
Well, and the other point that I would make is I didn't realize they were making you the head of the Galloway clan, but I've often answered to the name Galloway as well as McGillery and Gillyhooly and McGillicuddy. So if you become the head of the clan, I'll be right there with you for as long as I last.
You'll be welcome, James. And
okay.
As I say, there's a vacancy to be the chief of Clan Galloway. And I live in Galloway, my ancestral home. In fact,
you obviously have to have come from there because you've got the name.
Yes, and as there's a vacancy, can you think of a better chief of the Clan Galloway, James?
No, yeah. Well, anyway,
I'll put them on the map. I'll make them famous across the world. People will be buying Galloway tartans everywhere across the globe. James, thank you very much indeed for that call. Apparently, what you need to do is stand on a hill, put out a general call for all the Galloways that are interested in the election to come and stand with you on that hill, and by acclamation, you can get that gig. And I really fancy it. I really could market the Galloway clan, which is not a famous clan, by the way. I really could market that. I'm working with my friend, our editor, Ron Mackay, on a remarkable documentary to do with my antecedents. I'm not going to tell you any more, not least because it was probably on the wrong side of the blanket. But you'll be pretty startled when you learn who I am actually descended from, and not all that far back in history. Ron, am I giving away too much? I better shut up now about that. Mike says, Keir Starmer, I've binned a tea bag that has more charisma than Keir Starmer. That's cruel. Sven says, at least the block of wood has potential. It can be made into something useful. Very good, Sven. And on Twitter, Faith says, the Chinese do not care who is the head of state of Barbados. The resurgence of anti-monarchist sentiment in the Caribbean is because of the Windrush scandal. I didn't think of that, Faith. Well done. And on Facebook, Rob says, why, if the government is so concerned about our health, despite sending thousands away to be killed in created wars, is there no push whatsoever on how to stay healthy? Good point, Rob. And Tom says, God forbid if the Democrats should win the US election, because it's obvious Biden is struggling and Harris will take over from him within months of him being made president of the United States. Mary says, hasn't it been proven that in China they have people in camps and in prisons? Well, it's certainly true that they've got people in prisons, Mary, that they have in common with every single country in the world, although nothing like the proportion of prisoners that they have in the United States. There are no concentration camps in China. There is not 1 million Uyghurs in these concentration camps which don't exist. There is no forced sterilization of Muslims in China. In Xinjiang province alone, there are 25,000 mosques. 25,000 mosques. That's 10 times the number of mosques in the entire country of the United States. The Muslim population is growing, not falling. National minorities, of whom Muslims are one, are allowed to have 3 children, whilst the Han Chinese, the majority of Chinese, are allowed to have only 2. And when China had a one-child policy, its minorities had 2 children. And in fact, in many, many cases, and I've met some, there are not 3 children in a Muslim household. Sometimes there are 5 or more than 5. The standard of living of the Muslim people in Xinjiang is rocketing even faster than other areas of China. A huge investment is being made. Mary, the only people who are being locked up in re-education camps in China are the Al-Qaeda, ISIS fanatics who are responsible for significant, wide-scale and bloody terrorist atrocities in Xinjiang province in the name of Islamist extremism. Now, in the United States, they just killed them by drone. They just wiped them out with a helicopter gunship or a Hellcat missile. In China, they put them in a re-education center to try and win them away from that kind of extremist fanaticism. This story is right out of the same playbook that we were discussing earlier. We are in love with extremist Muslims abroad, as long as it's not the near abroad, as long as it's not in Paris or London or Birmingham or Bradford. Those kind of extremist Muslims, we lock them up, Mary, behind bars and for the rest of their lives. And a very good thing that is too. But don't expect China or Syria or Armenia to put up with these people when they're being funded and encouraged by us. This is an important lesson that I intend to go on teaching on the mother of all talk shows, on the Open University of the Airwaves. I saw an item in the British media this very week that said that you could be sent to one of these concentration camps for offences as trivial as possession of a Quran. 25,000 mosques in Xinjiang province alone. 25,000. And they are teeming from floor to ceiling, on every wall, with Qurans. So you can't be sent to a concentration camp for possession of a Quran, because in 25,000 mosques, there's at least 100 Qurans in every single one of them. And none of the people in the 25,000 mosques is being forced to eat pork, and neither would they. Coming up after the news, Dr. Ranjit Brar on the breaking coronavirus news tonight. I don't know what that breaking news is, but I'm sure I will learn during the break. On social media, on Facebook, Ian says, digital currency is great until someone in power decides to detonate a magnetic pulse weapon. Blimey, look on the dark side, Ian. Rob says, enjoy injecting aborted baby fetus cells in yourself, George. Aye, right, Rob. And on Twitter, Patrick says, Joe Biden at least has Alzheimer's as an available excuse. On a good day, he probably has some idea what he should be doing. Starmer has the charisma of a lighthouse, standing still and turning from one thing to another, but with no idea why. Patrick, that is definitely the tweet of the night so far. And on YouTube, Kevin says, I think in a few years' time, we will look back and realize we have overreacted and ruined a generation financially and should have followed Sweden's path on the coronavirus. Let's get the 9 o'clock news with Jamie Lowe.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Radio Sputnik News.
3 more counties in Wales are to be placed under local lockdowns from tomorrow evening. The Welsh Government has announced Neath, Port Talbot, Torfan and Vale of Glamorgan will have tighter COVID-19 restrictions. It means that half of Wales's 22 local authority areas will be under local lockdowns as rules come into force in Cardiff and Swansea this afternoon. Almost 2 million people in Wales, 2/3 of the population, will be under local lockdowns. Welsh local lockdown rules mean extended households must end and people are not allowed to leave or enter locked down areas without a reasonable excuse. The COVID-19 outbreak in Scotland is now being driven by infections among teenagers, figures show. More than 43% of the positive cases detected on Thursday were in the 15 to 19 age group, according to data published by Public Health Scotland. Infection rates in this age group were stable throughout the summer but began to rise sharply from mid-September. Public health teams are dealing with several outbreaks among students living in shared accommodation. The largest outbreak is at the University of Glasgow, where 172 students have tested positive. Britain's Culture Secretary has defended students going back to university in England. Oliver Dowden said it was important students did not give up a year of their life by not going. Labour has called on the government to consider pausing the return after COVID outbreaks meant thousands of students had to isolate in their accommodation. Dowden said, young people have paid a huge price during this crisis and I think it's only fair to try and get them back. We have got clear guidelines for them to follow. However, a scientist who advises the government said the situation was inevitable. Professor Mark Woolhouse, who sits on the government's pandemic modelling group, said the situation was entirely predictable and had been modelled. He also said that students were not to blame for outbreaks and with students converging from areas around the country, it was inevitable there would be some spread. Modelling showed the risk areas were first-year halls of residence and face-to-face teaching. The Labour Party is very sympathetic to a bid by Conservative MPs to increase parliamentary scrutiny over coronavirus restrictions in England. Shadow Justice Secretary David Lammy has said. Senior Tory rebel Sir Graham Brady has tabled an amendment which would allow MPs to vote on changes to lockdown rules. Several Tory MPs and the Lib Dems have also signalled support for the move. The government says it wants to work with MPs while ensuring ministers can react quickly to suppress the virus. It also has said that MPs will get a chance to vote retrospectively on the Rule of 6, which puts a limit on the number of people at social gatherings. A man has been arrested on suspicion of supplying a firearm following the fatal shooting of a police officer in a UK custody suite. Sergeant Matt Rattana died in hospital after being shot at Croydon Custody Centre in South London in the early hours of Friday. The arrest took place in Norwich around 2 a.m. this morning and the suspect is currently being detained at a South London police station. Meanwhile, the suspect for the Rattana shooting remains in a critical condition in hospital and officers say they have not yet been able to speak to him. US President Donald Trump has nominated Amy Coney Barrett, a favourite of social conservatives, to be the new Supreme Court Justice. Speaking by her side at the White House Rose Garden, Trump described her as a woman of unparalleled achievement. If confirmed by senators, Judge Barrett will replace Liberal Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who died recently, aged 87. The nomination will spark a bitter confirmation fight in the Senate as November's presidential election looms. Clashes have erupted between Armenian and Azerbaijani forces in the disputed Nagorno-Karabakh region, with civilian deaths reported by both sides. Armenia said Azerbaijan had launched an air and artillery attack. It later declared martial law and total military mobilization. Azerbaijan blamed Armenia and said it was responding to shelling along the whole front. The long-running conflict has flared up again in recent months. And finally, the son of the late motorbike stunt rider Evel Knievel is suing Disney over a daredevil character in the animated film Toy Story 4. Kelly Knievel has held the publicity rights to his father's name since 1998, according to his US District Court filing in Las Vegas. The federal trademark infringement lawsuit claims that Disney-owned Pixar did not ask permission to use his father's likeness when creating the character Duke Kaboom. Knievel is seeking damages of more than $300,000 over allegations including false endorsement and unjust enrichment. He said Evel Knievel did not thrill millions around the world, break bones, and spill his blood just so Disney could make a bunch of money. An Evel Knievel toy was released in 1973 with a white helmet and jumpsuit with a motorbike that could be propelled with a wind-up device. Disney and Pixar released a similar Duke Kaboom toy along with Toy Story 4 when the film came out last year. A Disney spokesman described Knievel's claims as meritless, saying the film company will defend itself vigorously. And that's the latest here on Sputnik News. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, the doctor will see you shortly, but here's the second poll of the evening, and it's a devilishly clever one. Who will be the candidate in the 2024 US presidential elections? Will it be Kamala Harris? Will it be Meghan Markle? You think I'm joking? She's not. Will it be Ivanka Trump? She's not joking either. Actually, all three of them have expressed a wish to become the President of the United States of America. If Joe Biden doesn't get replaced before the poll and the Democrats win, I reckon he'll last all of 6 weeks and Kamala Harris will be in the incumbency. Meghan Markle, she got the right stuff. She wears the right suits, if you'll forgive the pun. And Ivanka, now she would be a powerful candidate for Donald Trump's base, don't you think? Ivanka Trump is in the lead at the moment. The poll closes at 9:50. Thank you, son. That's my lovely grandson who goes to the School of Oriental and African Studies in the morning. Good luck with that, son. Now, COVID info for today. You heard the news from Jamie Lowe, the big swing in the spike of new infections is taking place amongst young teenagers, aged between 15 and 19. That's the people that the Labour Party and the Conservative Party insisted had to go back to school. That's the people, including Labour and the Conservatives, and especially the SNP in Scotland, insisted go back to university. No sooner had they arrived at the university, they were locked up in a cell, otherwise known as a student flat. Not permitted to leave, not permitted to go to a bar, not permitted to go to a restaurant, and above all, not permitted to go home to their parents to sit out the rest of the crisis. Big, big news, this. A very big new factor. 5,693 new cases in the last 24 hours, which is down from 6,042, although weekend reporting usually leads to an undercounting. And the number of deaths, of course, continues to increase too. 17 people died in Britain in the last 24 hours of the coronavirus. Let's see the doctor now without further delay. Dr. Ranjit Brar, NHS consultant, physician and surgeon, and all-round good egg. Dr. Ranjit, thanks for joining us again. Let's talk first, please, about this new information. Wales, 2/3 of the population of Wales, now under more serious lockdown than elsewhere in the country. Glasgow, now the epicenter of this appalling sea of misery that we have around this issue in the country, not just from the virus, but the opportunity cost of the virus, people with other illnesses, other conditions which are not being treated, operations cancelled, people's mental health problems, problems of civil liberties. We saw in Trafalgar Square yesterday some very ugly scenes. In amongst all this misery, Glasgow, the epicenter, young people, the new front. What's your observation on these?
Thanks, George. Good to be back with you. As you say, it's a very worrying moment. What's quite clear is that the population of our country, as indeed much of the world, but particularly our country, is suffering from, if you like, coronavirus fatigue. It's a story we wish would go away. It's a story none of us want to really be involved with, but it's a fact that we have to contend with and confront, George. And it's quite clear, increasingly clear, that our government hasn't really contended with it and hasn't really confronted it and never really had a plan. That initial plan of herd immunity, protect the economy, and if a few pensioners die, so be it, of allowing the virus really to spread unchecked through the population, has indeed been the underlying theme throughout. You know, it was briefly interrupted by a sudden draconian about-face and lockdown. And really, that's put Boris Johnson at odds with himself, with his own usual ideology, with his party. And we've seen that even now we're getting totally mixed messages about whether really we should all go back to work, or now we should all work from home. 1 minute we should all go to school, the next minute everyone who goes back to university is on lockdown. And we know that Boris Johnson was actively considering a so-called circuit breaker of a new, perhaps 1 or 2 week over the half-term period, total lockdown throughout the country, and was opposed by the rest of his cabinet, and particularly Rishi Sunak. So there is no unified government position on this, and the Tories are being driven, despite themselves, against their own kind of libertarian instincts, just by the sheer pandemonium of which they're overseeing due to their lack of adequate measures that they put in place. I mean, we don't need the vaccine to eradicate the virus. We've seen that in many countries, most notably China, where the virus was first identified, characterized, and that DNA code and testing was disseminated so transparently back in January, let's not forget. So now 8 months, there's no point quibbling about whether it could have been 1 or 2 weeks earlier, when we see that our own government have failed to put into place the very measures which could have got us back to normal. Wuhan, China, are literally having sporting events, social events, music concerts to celebrate returning to normal, despite their high level of vigilance, meaning a large testing program. We see that in our government, in our country, the 6th richest nation on earth, we've not been able to scale up testing adequately, so that there's huge backlogs in testing. Testing's been put on a totally different system outside the NHS, such that when they finally launched the Test and Track app this week, there were grave concerns, of course, 5 months ago about its privacy. That app, we've been told, has been rejigged to encode and protect people's privacy. But nonetheless, there were major failings with the app, such that 13% of users couldn't actually download it to their phones in the first place. A huge number of people found they were unable to put in negative results into the app, and therefore were told to isolate even though they don't have the virus. People on the Welsh borders were finding that they were receiving information in Welsh. They couldn't understand the information. And so a huge number of problems. And of course, we know that probably less than 50% of people who have the virus are being adequately traced, and their contacts are being traced. And we know that less than 20% are able to actually self-isolate because of economic and other social pressures. So all of the public health measures, which could have been put into place, which China disseminated throughout the world, showed worked, and other countries have been able to put into place. South Korea, of course, let's not forget, developed an app which met approval with their population. No reason why you can't have measures which meet approval with the population, with adequate communication and adequate dissemination of information, and a government which is trusted by its people. So that app was put in place within weeks of the viral outbreak, allowing people to see where were high and risk areas, what buildings were best to avoid because cases had been seen there. By contrast, it's been a totally laissez-faire approach. People have been very smug in our government about the declining number of cases. Then, of course, the famous eat out to help out, trying to get the relatively affluent to go back to restaurants, trying to get everyone to go back to schools and universities without really any adequate measures. So we've never really, throughout this pandemic, had sight of the virus. What we do have sight of is the figures of the numbers of cases. ONS are now saying probably close to 10,000 cases per day. The number of deaths last week was back towards just over the 200 mark, when it was down to single digits, certainly less than 100 for several weeks throughout August, when of course schools are out, universities were out, people were working from home. And of course, we know that poverty is rising as the economic crisis is worsening. Perhaps as many as 5 million people we're expecting by the end of the year to be essentially destitute, not able to afford food, clothing, housing and shelter. And of course, that will put them in a position where it's very hard for them to comply with restrictions. And increasingly, we're seeing a more draconian approach. And I think you're right. If you look at the demonstrations, people who are fed up, who don't trust the government, who don't trust its measurement, who've lost faith with the government to the extent that they think the entire virus itself is a conspiracy, no worse than a common cold, which I'm afraid is not true. That they have lost faith with the government, and the government's response to them, rather than persuading them or helping them, is to beat them off the street. Some of them quite elderly, grandmothers, really, the spectacle of them being beaten by the police certainly is not going to reduce the risk of the virus spreading, and it's certainly not going to increase the likelihood that the population will accept the government's leadership and comply meekly or comply with regulations which should be putting in place to protect our health, but which have manifestly not been adequately planned for, George.
I'm almost lost for words, actually, at the length of and the power of the indictment that you have just delivered. Our approach has been neither one thing nor the other. Am I right? It hasn't been South Korea and it hasn't been Sweden. It has veered between one and the other according to the prevailing political winds, and we still don't know, really, whether we're headed in the one direction or the other.
I think that's right, George. It's been without any joined-up thinking or planning. It's quite clear that the voices of reason have been arguing for public health measures. But of course, our very economic system, the way in which the prevailing policy of privatization and winding down a really comprehensive national health system in favor of a contracted out, subcontracted, privatized, not just PFI, but hospitals, services being privatized. Richard Branson suing Cambridge Hospital for not awarding him the pediatric services contract that he wanted for an unknown figure is just one example of that. Richard Branson is the largest GP now in the NHS. He holds some 4 million GPs services for some 4 million patients. And, the more you examine the NHS, the more you see it's broken down. It was remarkable to see that if you'd had a test for COVID, in an NHS facility, and that included an NHS hospital, that included Public Health England laboratories, that still exist, they've not been quite wound down, and that included an ONS testing facility. So all the major governmental pillars of testing, if you'd had a test from one of those sources, you could not place that into the track and trace app launched by the government. Only one from the Lighthouse laboratories, from the private sector, could be entered. So the level of disjointed thinking, Baroness Harding, who's been put in charge of track and trace. We've learned, her main contact. Of course, she was ennobled. She's an old a British peer from a British economic and military family, a very powerful family. She was a classmate of David Cameron and was enabled by David Cameron. She's been further empowered by Boris Johnson under this administration and put in charge of a hugely important service with tens and perhaps hundreds of billions of pounds at her disposal for this one simple task of finding out who has the virus, scaling up our testing to adequately meet the need, sharing that information and planning accordingly. And there's abject failure to do so, and there's absolutely no accountability. These contracts are going out to companies like Serco. Serco, we know the CEO is Rupert Soames, brother of the MP, Nicholas Soames, who's much lauded for being the grandson of Winston Churchill. But these are the figures who, we're used to the idea that when we invade foreign governments, much as we may not like it, Libya, we steal their sovereign wealth fund. Iraq, we steal their gold reserves. But it's kind of understood tacitly that we're going to those countries to steal their oil, but I don't think it's fully appreciated the extent to which when the Conservative administration and indeed other administrations, we can look at Blair and see the personal fortune he amassed. When they get into office, their sole mission is to empower their corporate acquaintances and friends to loot the British Treasury, not to serve the interests of the British people. And I think that if you really look at this testing and tracing, if you look at the fact Dido Harding, Sir Simon Stevens, who is the chief executive of NHS England, but himself is someone who is appointee of large American health corporations and has been working them for 10 years, has come back with a mission to privatise the NHS, and indeed Matt Hancock. All of them are involved together in racing. They're all involved in the jockey club. They all have horse racing, an interest in horse racing. The way in which they socialise, the circles in which they socialise, the obvious ways in which their interests run counter to the interests of the general population, and that's highlighted really by the overall ethos and the backbenchers, the 1922 committee. Most of the new crop of Tory MPs again are of this libertarian thinking, and they merge to a certain extent with a certain more anarchistic group of the left who just are totally against any kind of state controls. But for this Tory administration, they really feel their main aim is to put more and more wealth into the hands of their corporate cronies, and they really, are not planning and do not care about the overall general health of the population. So their occasional breakthrough of draconian measures and police beating up crowds, or whether it's a total lockdown for the country, at the same time as huge intermittent bailouts for businesses, not for people but for businesses, and the poorest of the workers who were anyway unemployed long term receive the least in terms of subsidy and support. We saw suddenly that the homeless disappeared from our streets during lockdown in March and April, but suddenly they're back again. I mean, this pandemic and this situation looks very different depending on your economic circumstances, George. And, it's really what we're seeing once again is that this pandemic is holding up a mirror to our society, which is revealing so much that is wrong and needs to be urgently corrected.
Mirror, mirror on the wall, who is the ugliest of them all? I think you've got it in one. Thank you, Dr. Bra, as always, for that tour de force. The poll, who will be the candidate in the 2024 presidential election? Kamala Harris, 36, Meghan Markle, 23, Ivanka Trump in the lead with 41. I hope Donald's watching. Now, Rick says, can we talk about the police in the Trafalgar Square protest in London, beating peaceful protesters with batons? We have, Rick, in my opening remarks, and there with Dr. Brar. And Jenny says, interesting that China supposedly steals intellectual property, yet has the most advanced technology in the world. And Max says, I would try the Russian vaccine. Would I give it to my child? No. But George didn't suggest that either. And Ryan says, if you look at this current virus pandemic crisis, the rich have gotten even richer, just like back in 2008 in the financial crisis. God forbid if the Democrats should win the US election because it's obvious Biden is struggling and Harris will take over from him within months. And Stephen says, what do you make of the London demonstrations? I've made my point on that, Stephen. June says, The student situation is a shambles and a shame on the governments. And on YouTube, Max says, if 9/11 was a false flag, the government had the opportunity to evacuate the towers, which would give much kudos to the government, whilst allowing the attack to continue. Just makes no sense that so many should die. Ashok is in Havant, and he was at the London protest yesterday. Ashok, welcome to the show. Tell us what happened.
Well, yeah, I was there, and it was all very peaceful and amicable with the police right up until the end, because the police were just intermingled with the crowd, and some people were just chatting to the police, and there's actually kind of a peace and love vibe going on, because we were all just there just to basically try and stand up for freedom. And then David Icke came on, and he gave a speech that was actually mainly sort of like New Age spirituality, saying how, we're all one consciousness and everything.
Well, he would, wouldn't he?
Well, yeah, but yeah, and then he finished his speech, and I was mainly there to see him. So I started heading out of the square at about that point. And right then, just from around the corner, a squad of police, looking for all the world like, a squad of movie stormtroopers, they suddenly just charged into the square, and they just made straight for the stage where the speakers were. And bearing in mind, we had just been listening to about 3 hours of speeches about, how we were gradually being transformed into a police state under the guise of trying to protect us from this virus. And so I think a lot of us thought that they would probably come to, arrest Piers Corbyn like they did last time. And so I think some people were just trying to sort of block the police from charging the stage. And that's when the mood just completely turned and, scuffles started. But if they hadn't have charged into the square like that, the whole thing would have gone off completely amicably and peacefully.
Did they give any warning to leave the area or anything like that?
Well, throughout the event, the guy that was emceeing it kept saying, please try and maintain social distance. And actually, I was moving through the square. It wasn't ram-packed. There were a lot of people there.
Yeah, about 15,000 it looked to me, which is sizable enough, but it's a big square.
Yeah, and we kept on getting sort of, being asked to maintain space, and we didn't get any warning that we weren't doing that. But and yeah, so it was all entirely peaceful just until the police suddenly charged in, and then that's what completely turned the mood.
It just doesn't make any sense. And some of the footage I saw, I saw an old lady getting punched in the stomach and knocked over. What kind of policing is that?
Exactly. It was really very scary. I'd never seen anything like that before, and immediately I just started getting flashes of newsreel footage I'd seen about, like apartheid South Africa or like dictatorships in South America. It completely felt like a real kind of clampdown on freedom of speech, and it actually seemed like an illustration of everything we'd been warned about for the last 3 hours, what people were trying to warn us what the country was becoming. It's like a live-action demonstration.
Sounds horrific. Ashok, thanks for bringing us up to date on that. Michael is in Minneapolis on Kamala Harris, or Kamala Harris, as I should call her. Go ahead, Michael.
Hey, George. Good to be on.
And you.
About Kamala Harris, and yes, that is the correct way to pronounce it. I had heard you say a few things that you sort of weren't sure of her origin, so I figured it was worth calling in.
Yes.
Sort of delineate that for you.
Yeah, in Britain,
Kamala,
we never heard of her until she became a runner and then dropped out before a single vote was cast.
Yes. So I will bring you up to speed in as succinct a manner as possible. Kamala Harris burst onto the scene by running sort of a well to the right as a prosecutor in San Francisco, where she was able to take over, and she was sort of became infamous for, as she said, using her political capital to go after parents for their children's truancy, So she sort of went after parents whose kids were skipping class, which is, I won't go into that. But she also declined to prosecute Steve Mnuchin and One West Bank, despite the fact her office said they had broken over 1,000 laws and could have easily broken over 1,000 more with more investigation. Steve Mnuchin then, as you may know, went on to not only donate to her Senate campaign, although despite the fact he's a Republican, but now he is serving in Trump's cabinet. And, had he been prosecuted by Harris, he may be in jail at this point, to be perfectly honest. Senator, Harris then became a senator. And what's really interesting is that she was sort of anointed behind the scenes. So in 2017, over the New Year's holiday, she met with Hillary Clinton and a lot of the Clinton and big Democratic Party power brokers in the Hamptons. And at this meeting, it was reported at the time, the Clintons signaled publicly that they were going to put their weight behind Harris for the 2020 nomination. So as you know, in the United States, there are basically two powerful factions in the Democratic Party. There's Obama and there's the Clintons. And so the Clintons went all in on Harris way back in 2017, and they really pushed her. A lot of the whole party apparatus got behind her. Despite this fact, she was not popular with the voters, and as you know, was projected to finish sixth in her own home state of California, and was polling at, I think 2 or 3% towards the end when she dropped off. So I think what's really instructive about the Kamala Harris and Joe Biden ticket is that the Democratic Party sort of gives you your medicine whether you want it or not. So, Joe Biden, as you know, was in 4th or 5th place when Barack Obama made the calls around before Super Tuesday, when Bernie Sanders was about to run off to an insurmountable lead, got Pete Buttigieg and Amy Klobuchar to drop out, throw their support behind Biden, got his cabinet to get behind Biden. And so we ended up, in the media got behind Biden, and we ended up, Bernie, as you know, sort of gave up on his own movement. And so we kind of got stuck with Joe Biden. And the same way, Kamala Harris, who despite having the entire party machinery behind her, was not able to catch on at all with voters, we are still looking at her as the likely next vice president and the likely Democratic president, despite the fact that she had zero popularity with the voters because of her flip-flops on numerous issues. She was for Medicare for all, and then she was against it, et cetera, et cetera. She's sort of a transparent in her, sort of blind ambition and sort of lack of any particular thing she wants to accomplish other than to attain power. So the Biden-Harris ticket is really the ticket of, we didn't want these people, but the Democratic Party decided you're going to take your medicine, and now we're stuck with them. So I think it kind of encapsulates that we don't really have the options when, that we really are an oligarchy and we don't have a lot of options when we go and cast our ballot.
Michael, you are an education every time you come on this show. Thank you very much indeed for that. Let's stay in America, go to Massachusetts and talk to Wilfredo. Go ahead, Wilfredo.
Thank you. I really like your show. I like how you confront the issues, and I appreciate your honesty in all regards.
Thank you, sir.
I was calling because I wanted to know if you have heard of David Graeber. He's a professor in one of the universities in London.
He died recently, yeah?
Yes, and I thought if you knew about him that you might say something, but if you don't, that's okay. He wrote
I didn't know anything about him until he died, but he seems to have been greatly revered by some of the best people in the land. So if you would like to pay tribute to him, you're more than welcome to.
Yes, and I want to invite you to read some of his works. The most monumental is Debt, the First 5,000 Years, where I learned a lot. Even though I'm a university graduate, I graduated from Boston College, and I had read many of the books that he comments on in his book Debt, but I never got the insight that he provides in that book about what they really were saying and where that concept of debt came from and how it grounded the history of humanity. So that I would love to have you read it and get some comments on it on your show.
Okay, I'm really very busy and it's a big book, but I'll do my best. Wilfredo, Thanks for that tribute to the late Mr. Graeber, Dr. Graeber. A 60-second break, and then it's calls all the way through to the end of the show. Stay tuned.
Radio Sputnik.
Tune in every Wednesday to Loud and Clear with Brian Becker and John Kiriakou for a regular segment called Beyond Nuclear, where Brian and John discuss nuclear issues, including weapons, energy, waste, and the future of nuclear technology in the United States, with Kevin Camps, the radioactive waste watchdog at the organization Beyond Nuclear. Listen on Wednesdays right here on Radio Sputnik.
Want to talk? Get in touch with us at radio@sputniknews.com. We are talking
24 hours a day, 7 days a week.
You are listening.
We give you the most essential out of the endless information space.
Radio Sputnik, telling the untold. Radio Sputnik. We speak your language. Find us at SputnikNews.com.
Hello, America. It is me, Joe Biden. I think I'm not reading a teleprompter. I'm perfectly capable of speaking for myself. Myself.
Radio Sputnik.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
Now, Alice asks on Twitter, could Michelle Obama step in to replace Biden? Not if Kamala Harris can help it. And on email, Anthony says, I quite honestly believe that Biden and Trump are sometimes under the influence of drugs, perhaps stimulants. I don't think they would even put Biden up on the stage without it. But for Trump, I'd imagine it's more a matter of personal preference. Your views, not mine, Anthony, just in case he's listening, because Ivanka is running away with the poll here on the Mother of All Talk Shows and on Facebook. David says, George, when will you cash in your cryptocurrency fortune? What if it crashed? Well, I'm hardly going to tell you that, David. That would make it crash, because I bought rather a lot. And Diane says, the people of the UK hate Trump, but Boris Johnson loves him. I very much doubt if Boris Johnson loves him. They both got a mop of blonde hair, but Boris Johnson speaks Greek and Latin better than Donald Trump speaks English. The cultural level is incomparable. And Brian says the US market will collapse. The bubble will burst. Dermot says Trump is the biggest danger to world stability. He is no friend of the working class. And on YouTube, Ben makes the not unfair point. Crack cocaine is double the price of gold. I doubt it could ever be used as a currency, though. Hope not, Ben. Here's Martin in Oregon on Lee Harvey Oswald stroke JFK. Go ahead, Martin.
Hello, George. It's good to hear your voice and honored to talk to you.
Yeah, thank you. It's good of you to call. We're going to deal with this in depth on Moats Extra over the next few weeks. But go ahead. You've got a point of view.
I sure do. It sounded like earlier in the program you mentioned Lee Harvey Oswald as the assassin in Kennedy murder.
Yeah, I was quoting the Warren Commission, of course.
I see. Yes. Because in a lot of people have problems with that Warren Commission report, and I was just going to mention, in case you were buying that line, that
no, not me. Not me. When
Lee Harvey Oswald was arrested, they did this paraffin test, which was meant to determine as to whether or not he had fired a weapon.
Yeah.
So when you fire a weapon, gunshot residue will be deposited on the person using the gun. And those paraffin tests showed that Lee Harvey Oswald did not fire a rifle on that day.
Yeah, I believe, as he said himself, he was a patsy.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And it sounds like, rather than my pushing back, it sounds like we're in alignment.
Well, we're on the same
issue.
page, but we will go into it in some considerable depth, Martin, over the next couple of weeks once we start the Moats Extra, as we will be doing with 9/11, with the coronavirus, all these deeply controversial issues. We'll be doing in-depth programs on them. So stay tuned, stay alert, and join us.
Well, could I make a recommendation? If you haven't already contacted, there's a historian by the name of James DiEugenio. He's collected quite a bit of information on this assassination topic, and he might be worth looking into.
I'm sure my friends have noted that, and definitely, if we can, we'll take you up on that suggestion, Martin, in Oregon. Thank you very much. From Oregon to Motherwell, of course, it's Derek on the UK government. Go ahead, Derek.
George, how are you?
Good, I'm glad to hear from you.
Not too bad. How many people, George, does it take to enter the centre of London before the government, who represent the citizens, pay heed to what we want and need? Give us a number, George.
Well, it will not be, need to be a lot more than 15,000.
But you had 1 million for the stop the war, and that wasn't enough.
We had 2 million, and it wasn't enough.
2 million.
And so the numbers themselves are not anywhere near that kind of level. The opinion polling actually is heavily weighted with people that want the government to go much further, not less far, on cracking down, locking up, locking down, and so on. So I think you're a long way from being a majority, which doesn't mean you're not right, Derek.
But if all the activists, George, for every major cause come together, united we stand, these opinion polls are made up by the government, possibly. They don't represent the people.
I
and
doubt
what we
that,
need,
because
George.
they're quite critical of the government. But of course, everybody in Britain has a right to protest and demonstrate and to actually club people and prove their point about the authoritarianism, about the autocratic way in which the British state is run, is extremely foolish, whatever your point of view.
George, when I look at some of the signs, and I say it myself, see when we say the 99% who are the people, see this 1% at the top. How do we out these people? Because it's not politicians that represent the local people. There's 1%, the shadowy 1% that are in every country. How do we out these people, George? How do we find out who they are? How do we put their names up so that we can actually physically know who are making the decisions?
We do our best. We do our best here on the mother of all talk shows. It's not always easy to identify the names and the pack drill, but in the first story we did this evening, I've pointed you at the grey zone where you'll be able to read the names of the people that took your money for selling fake news about the Al-Qaeda and ISIS in Syria. That's the kind of thing we try and do. Derek, thanks for the call. Staying in Scotland, Gerard is in Kilwinning. Lodge number nothing there, Gerard.
No, George, my team won 3-0 today, so I'm a happy
So did
man.
mine.
All right. That's good to know.
But Lodge number nothing is in Kilwinning. You knew that, right?
Oh, no, listen, I know my fiance's down here. I think we're the only Catholics in the village, quite literally.
Go ahead, Gerard.
George, just very quickly, your poll about who's going to be the president in 2024.
Yeah. It's
going to be a man, George. It's going to be a friend of Jesse Ventura. It's going to be another wrestler, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson. Telling you right now, the man's intelligent, with the looks, the charisma. Certainly rather have him than Miss Markle anyway.
Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson.
Yep.
I'll look him up. We'll try and interview him, Gerard.
He's a busy man, but I'm sure he came on for you, George.
Well, look, that would be quite a contest. Dwayne The Rock against the daughter of Donald Trump. That would be the mother of all presidential bouts.
It'd be a good laugh. I think I know who I would pick to win, though. Anyway, but on the serious front, unfortunately, Mr. Trump, George, has said that, like you said, he's not giving up power. Now, I don't like Biden, but I want him to win, but I don't think it's actually going to matter now. What do you think is actually going to happen? I know you talked a few weeks ago about...
I think it'll go to the court. I think it'll go to the court, Gerard. And I think depending on how obvious it is, if the Democrats have really obviously won, you'll probably get a defection or two on the Supreme Court from the normally reliable right-wing Republican appointees. But if it's close in any way, if they can in any way, they'll give it to Trump, and then there'll be the mother of all battles breaks out across the US.
People have actually now been talking, some jokingly, but some seriously, about a second American Civil War. Now, I don't think it's going to get to that stage, but I think we are in a position. There are extremists on both sides. You see them on the streets, the MAGA supporters with their machine guns. But then you do have the Antifa people as well. You know, there are extremists on the left as well.
It will be a first American guerrilla civil war. It will not be pitched armies fighting each other at Gettysburg, one lot in blue and the other lot in red. It wouldn't happen that way. But you could have effectively a mass outbreak of guerrilla violence, terrorism, and all kinds of horrors. I pray that doesn't happen, because I love America. I love American people. I pray that doesn't happen, but it could.
Absolutely. I mean, the thing is, as well, is that to take a cynical look, if I was the Russians or the Chinese, I would be doing my best to make sure that happens, because that would stop, you know, the American military killing me. I'm just looking from a purely cynical point of view, but that's what if I was the Russians or the Chinese, trying to do my sort of, secret agent style work to make sure...
I can't speak for them, obviously, but Putin this week offered cast iron guarantees, a treaty effectively, that neither country would interfere in the internal political life of the other. And that was a pretty good offer, I thought. It's been dismissed out of hand in the United States. Gerard, thanks for that call. Raymond is in Dundee, my own hometown. Go ahead, Raymond.
Hello there, George. Hope you're feeling top of the morning.
I'm fine, I'm good. Go ahead.
My question relates to this never-ending issue in Scotland about another independence referendum.
Never-ending, I call it, Raymond.
So do I, George. And in the first never-endum, the no vote won by 2 million votes to 1.6 million.
Yeah.
And my argument is this. Because the SNP talk about democratic mandates, and they put it in their manifesto every Scottish election, saying that if they win the majority of votes, they'll bring in another referendum. I answer them by saying your democratic mandate better beat 2 million votes, because that's where the bar is set. And that was the democratic decision. If you want to reverse it and change it, that's your target. And if you don't beat it, just shut up and drop out.
Brilliant, Raymond. They don't even get 1 million votes, never mind 2 million. Great call and a great plan, actually. I hope the powers that be will take that on board. Let's go to Oakland in California, where Jason is on the line. Go ahead, Jason.
Hey, what's going on, George? Been a while. Great show.
Lovely to hear your voice again, your wonderful dulcet tones. Go ahead.
Thank you, sir. So today, you had Ben Norton. Amazing. I love that guy.
He's amazing. I don't know what age he is, but when he's older, I hope he's in the Senate.
Right? Absolutely. Absolutely. So, talking about, propaganda and, being manufactured and stuff like that. One thing that I was really glad that you finally talked about the whole Uyghur thing. I've study that. I've been reading about that a lot.
It's just it's the biggest hoax since the WMD, and from the same people.
Well, my whole thing is look, why are there 55 ethnic Muslim groups in China, right? Why are they just attacking the Uyghurs?
Yeah.
Obviously it's BS. There's the ETIM, the East Turkmenistan Islamic Movement, and why are they killing
which is an affiliate of Al-Qaeda. Actually,
Exactly.
the Uyghurs are one of the biggest detachments of Al-Qaeda and ISIS forces in Syria. There's thousands of them.
Yep. And actually, in fact, the terrorists, the attacks in that region have gone to virtually zero.
Partly because of China's actions, but also partly because they're in Syria. And now they'll be on their way to fight for Azerbaijan.
Well, now, the next thing now that I've been noticing, so my wife is from Thailand, right? And this is hitting home. What I've been noticing what's going on now is a new color revolution. You've got that kid, they call him the Penguin, that's going on out there. What I noticed is the second that Prayut Chan-o-cha, who's the president, the prime minister right now, started to make stronger connections with China, all of a sudden, there's all this color revolution going on, and it says NED all over it. I've been doing a lot of research.
You have, I can tell. Jason, thanks for a wonderful call. Robert is in Tennessee, who loves England. What's not to love, Robert? Go ahead.
Hello, George. It's good to hear you. I discovered you today, earlier.
How wonderful.
And,
lovely. I like new viewers, new listeners.
What did you say there?
I'm always delighted at new people coming to the University of the airwaves.
Oh, that's right. Yes. Well, I'll start listening now that I know where you are and how I can get you on.
Excellent.
But I just wanted to mention that things are bad all over. We have a moron for a president, and things are really going downhill here.
Yeah, you've got a moron for a president and a corpse running against him.
Well, I don't know about that. Take the lesser of two evils.
No, you see, I don't buy that, Robert, because, first of all, it's highly debatable which is the lesser of the two evils between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, for me. But moreover, if you keep picking the lesser of two evils, everything just gets more and more evil.
Well, I hadn't thought of that, but you're correct.
Thank you.
I happen to like Joe Biden, and I've seen what Donald Trump has done. We've lost our reputation as world leaders. Admittedly, we should have, because we're not a world leader anymore. We've withdrawn from everything, and he's also fouling up our natural resources over here. That's the least of it.
Robert, only because of the hour, I have to bring our conversation to a close, but I do hope you'll call back again. I just love your accent apart from anything else. That's Robert in Tennessee. But the main thing is that I have to clear the decks because there's a legend on the line. It's Norma in Bristol. She's back. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George.
People have been so worried about you, my dear.
Oh, come on. No, well, to be honest, I have been a bit up and down this week, but I've been watching the tennis tonight as well as your program.
Is that the French Open?
Yeah. We lost all the British players, the best ones. They're all gone.
Murray was easily defeated, yeah?
Yes, very Conte, Dan Evans, they've all gone. Anyway,
for me, there's been no tennis since McEnroe and Connors.
Yeah, but that's a long time ago.
Ili Nastasi and that era. That was tennis. Now it's just, it's a ball being fired like a bullet.
It's all right. I like it.
Yeah?
I like it.
All right.
Anyway, George, it's been a little bit complicated tonight for me. I got a bit stumped with Max Kaiser and his bitcoins, and Ben Norton. I was listening and got lost a bit with that. So I think I would bring up a lighter subject.
Yes, go ahead.
And actually, I watched this film, which was called Amazing Grace, which was about William Wilberforce and the abolition of slavery.
Yeah.
And, it was a good film. It was ever so well done. And that brought me to think, well, I expect people know, but in Bristol, our Colston Hall, the music hall, has now got a lovely new name, and it's called the Beacon Hall, which apparently they say it's a beacon of light for the future for everybody to enjoy.
Now, was that controversial? Just for people who don't know, Colson was a slave trader. It was his statue that ended up in the drink in the harbour, which was a remarkable piece of political theatre. And then they fished the statue out of the drink, and they were going to be consulting people. So has this been a controversial move? Because, of course, his name is on all kinds of things, on the square, on the theatre, and so on. But now they've changed it, you say?
Well, no, they were talking about it, actually, before that statue was pulled down, because some people wouldn't go to the Colston Hall. Some people wouldn't even perform there because of the name.
Really?
And it's been 3.5 years. And I thought Beacon Hall is quite a nice name. It's a beacon of light for the future. And, you know...
That's a very beautiful idea. Was there a vote held, or was it the local council that decided?
No, it was the lady that was in charge of the whole of the music hall.
She had the power to rename it.
She did. No, they did loads and loads of. They asked people what they thought, this, that, and the other. But I think she came down with the final name.
Okay.
But the other thing, quick, it is Mordecai Vannunu's day on Friday this week. You know, the man that was revealed the nuclear weapons for Israel.
Indeed, yes.
Yeah.
He is, because he's still alive, although not allowed to travel, one of the bravest and most important men in recent history.
Yeah,
he came to London. He tried to get the Daily Mirror, then owned by Robert Maxwell, to publish his story, including his diagrams and drawings and photographs. And the proprietor of the Daily Mirror, the father of Ghislaine Maxwell, betrayed his whereabouts to the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad. And though the story was eventually run by my friend Andrew Neil in the Sunday Times, it didn't have the same impact it would have had in the then Daily Mirror. And not long afterwards, Mordecai Vanunu was kidnapped in a honey trap by a woman called Cindy in Leicester Square, and ended up on trial with his jaws wired together, Norma, so that he couldn't speak, like the Silence of the Lambs, and then sentenced to what became 17 years in solitary confinement. I'm glad you brought that up, Norma. I didn't realize that was his birthday on Friday, and we should all wish him the very happiest of birthdays. And may this year have been his last year in the kind of captivity and restrictions in which he is held. Norma in Bristol is back and sounding on good form. Thank you for that. Kamala Harris, 32. Meghan Markle, 25. She'll be disappointed in that. Ivanka Trump, the daughter of Donald Trump, winning easily, 42 up 1. That's very interesting indeed. Now, last couple of messages. Is Ivanka the daughter or the wife? I always get the name wrong, but definitely his daughter would run, not his wife. His daughter will run, and his wife hates her and will do anything that she can to damage her. Maybe she'll write a book about her. Sam says America will be sick of megalomaniacs by then. That's the spelling of megalomaniac by then. I'm not so sure, Sam. Helena says Elizabeth Warren and Mike Pence. Elizabeth Warren's all dried up, in my opinion. And Stevie says Carol Baskin and Kanye West. Poor Kanye, I think he's beginning to lose the plot. Alan says, I would prefer Mrs. Doubtfire to these choices. And Rob says, sorry, I've done Rob already. Bilal says, George, you've told us that our government is lying to us. So why are they lying about this virus that has killed only 0.01% of the world population? Well, we'll be dealing with all of these subjects again next week. Come back at the same time, same place.